Okay, I'm just going to ask anybody who hears this, just please feel free to say hi in the YouTube comments so we can know we're broadcasting appropriately. Okay, it looks like we're live. All right, welcome everybody. We're very excited to have you at our workshop today. Give me a second to get some slides on. Okay, my name is Chetan Pandrinath. I'm an assistant professor in biomedical engineering at Emory and Georgia Tech, and part of our Simons-Emory International Consortium on Motor Control. I'll be keeping things moving and moderating today's discussion. So before we get started, I wanted to take a second to thank the many folks who pitched in to make this possible, and especially Amanda Jacobs, the extremely capable operations manager of the Simons-Emory Consortium, who really ensured all this came together, and then others in the consortium like Sam Sober and Gordon Berman, and the many volunteers we have working behind the scenes to help field questions. And I also want to thank Tierra Ward and the Emory Theory and Modeling of Living Systems group, which I'll tell you more about in a second. So now, who are we? The Simons-Emory International Consortium on Motor Control is a group of 8 labs supported by generous funding from the Simons Foundation that studies motor control through a broad range of approaches that span large-scale recording of neural and muscle activity and sophisticated computational techniques spanning rodent to non-human primate to human neuroscience. So you can learn more about the consortium and check out past workshops and open positions on our website. And then 2 very quick plugs. Emory Theory and Modeling of Living Systems is co-hosting this event, and many of their other events may also interest you. So here's a sample of this past year's events and some upcoming ones. So definitely follow them on Twitter to keep up with these great topics. And also a quick plug for Atlanta in general. So you might only know Georgia as a key battleground state and a political hotbed, but it's also the home of some amazing neuroscience with a tight-knit community that spans Emory, Georgia Tech, Georgia State, and more. And we recently started a Twitter feed to try to keep folks up to date with what's happening here in Atlanta, led by Lena Ting. So please check this out. And now I wanted to say thank you to all of you out there who are participating in this workshop. It's really been overwhelming to see the kind of response we've gotten. We've had almost 1,800 people register. So that's phenomenal. And here's a partial breakdown. So it's really wonderful and really motivating to see such interest at all levels of training and even participation from industry, which tells us that there's an interest in thinking about how we can take these concepts and potentially apply them to real world research and application. So thank you all for joining us, especially in this crazy year with the pandemic and uncertainty and all the kind of unrest and injustice that we've really seen highlighted this year. I know there's a lot on people's minds. If there's any kind of silver lining from this year, I really hope it's that we'll see more events like this to try to make science more open and accessible for everyone out there. So thank you very much for participating. So let's talk about today's schedule. Here's the first hour. You'll get to hear from 3 amazing postdocs that have been doing some really influential work in this space since their PhDs. So I'll go ahead and introduce them now. Saurabh Vyas did his undergrad at Johns Hopkins in biomedical engineering and electrical engineering, and he did his PhD at Stanford with Krishna Shenoy. So his work has really revealed kind of some fundamental links between population dynamics and motor learning, and how activity relates during movement and even in the absence of movement in areas like motor and premotor cortex. So now he's a postdoc at Columbia working with Mark Churchland to understand how motor and frontal areas coordinate to guide movements over medium to long timescales. And then you'll hear from Abby Russo. Abby is a postdoc at Princeton with Carlos Brody and Jonathan Pillow, and a 2020 Mistletoe Research Fellow. She did her graduate work with Mark Churchland at Columbia, where she won the 2020 Kavli Institute Award for Distinguished Research in Neuroscience. And then, let's see if I can get this right. And then you'll hear from Francesca Mastro Giuseppe, hope I got that, who is now currently doing her postdoc at Gatsby at UCL with Peter Latham. She did her PhD in theoretical neuroscience at École Normale Supérieure in Paris, working with Sergin Osojic. So I think you'll, what I really love here is that there are these fantastic young minds, kind of driving the field, and I really hope everyone appreciates what they're about to hear. After their talks, we'll have a very brief, just technical Q&A. The goal here is just to get any kind of technical concerns or questions or points of uncertainty out of the way, so we can kind of open the door for higher level discussion later on. Okay, and then the second hour, you'll get to hear from really, some of my heroes in the field who I somehow duped into getting to speak with you today. So we'll get to hear from Mehrdad Jazayeri at MIT, who will tell us about dynamics and cognition and some ideas about how we can connect neural computation to algorithms. And then we'll hear some very brief perspectives from our panelists, starting with Krishna Shenoy, then John Krakauer, Adrian Fairhall, and Abby Person. So that's the schedule. After that, we're going to turn to a panel discussion and open it up for discussion and questions from the panel, questions from the audience. Two quick things to note. So there are two places here where I might be kind of unusually heavy-handed. We have a packed schedule, so I'll have to keep things moving. I apologize in advance for that. And the second, so I might cut people off if we have to. The second thing is just, as you can see, we have a diversity of people from various levels of training, as well as with various interests here. And my goal is just to make sure everybody can be kind of represented in the conversation. So if needed, I might kind of jump in and try to guide the conversation so that we can hear a little bit more from people that might not have spoken up. So that's where we are. There's a little bit of information in the YouTube description for how you can submit your questions. And if we're able, we'd love to be able to bring you actually into the Zoom call at the right time, if possible. If your question is chosen, please don't join the Zoom call otherwise. And this is, borrowing from what we've seen, great work from John and others in the Learning Salon. So we'll try it, but be forewarned, if this becomes cumbersome, we're just gonna read questions directly. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and I'll turn it over now to Saurabh. Saurabh, please take it away.
Are my slides showing up, Chetan?
Perfect.
Awesome. Let me just move this. I don't know how to move this out of the way. Okay, well, all right. Well, I want to start by thanking Chetan for this absolutely wonderful opportunity to speak here today. And in fact, actually all of you on YouTube that are here and showing interest in this field. My goal in these 15 minutes will be to describe to you what we're calling computation through dynamics, or CTD for short. And I'm going to focus on actually just three simple questions: the what, the why, and the how. That is, what exactly is CTD? Is it a hypothesis? Is it a framework? Why did we go down this road in the first place? And finally, how will it help us learn new things about the brain? So I want to start by making our goal extremely clear, and that is to understand the relationship between brain and behavior. So naturally, we need to measure the behavior as well as the neural responses, and then find some sort of way to link the two together. And we typically start by considering the behavior first, which in my opinion is always the right thing to do. So once we've identified the right task for our question of interest, for example, this maze task where the monkey reaches around barriers, we have the ability in the laboratory to measure the behavior very, very well. For example, here I'm showing you the kinematics, the reaches that the animal makes. And usually in motor control, we're also interested in examining the muscle activity. So here I'm showing you as an example, the EMG recording from the deltoid, but we typically measure several muscles. Note that the colors here are matched to the kinematics. Recently, there's also been a lot of interest in very seriously quantifying the behavior. So this includes things like measuring joint angles, deploying musculoskeletal models, as well as utilizing markerless motion capture techniques. All of that to say, at least in the motor system, where we have access to these low-level readouts, we have a pretty good handle on the behavior. And that's quite critical because studying the behavior can often give us foundational insights into the algorithms that the nervous system might be employing. And that has often been the basis for many of the hypotheses that we have about these neural responses. So with a firm grasp on this behavior, we want to turn to the neural responses. And I'm going to go back to this reaching example. Now, I happened to take a photo of the very first neuron that I ever recorded from the monkey brain. And here it is. And here's the mean firing rate for one specific reaching condition. So the x-axis here is time, and it spans the full duration of the reach. Now, if every single neuron looked like this in motor cortex and critically varied systematically with things like the reaching direction, the speed by which you were reaching, and so on, we'd probably be good to go and make a lot of progress towards our goal. But alas, that does not seem to be the case. Here are 3 neurons that Mark Churchland recorded from the same monkey, same brain region, and essentially doing the same task. The colors here are again matched to the kinematics in the top left. Since you're all on YouTube, you can actually pause the video here if you wanted and stare at these neural responses for a while. And if you did that, you would discover something very problematic. These responses are multiphasic, they're complex, and very heterogeneous. Moreover, these responses often vary with things like the speed, the direction, and so on in very idiosyncratic ways. And if all of that wasn't challenging enough, turns out these responses rarely match the individual muscles themselves. You'll hear much more about this during Abby's talk, which is next, but the point for now is that we cannot rely on the assumption that single neuron responses are intimately tied to individual movement parameters. So what do we do? Well, we know that the brain is actually a distributed network of billions of interconnected neurons. Other fields across science and engineering have given us a number of tools to study these types of networks. And in particular, they've revealed that there are these network level properties that we should care about. Thus, our hypothesis is that perhaps by looking for these network principles, we could come up with a good theory that might link brain with behavior. So what exactly constitutes a good theory? Well, I posit that a good theory has at least 4 necessary conditions. These include a theory that can explain the single neuron responses. It needs to explain the population responses. It better explain the behavior. And hopefully it does all of this with some sort of concrete and quantitative model that respects network principles. So with these requirements in mind, we can now plainly state that CTD is neither anti-single neuron nor a way to hide from the complexity that we're seeing. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. Hopefully it's a framework that can help us tackle it. So how do we study neural populations? Well, we've been recording from these individual neurons. I'm showing you 3 examples here. And if we consider a very specific window of time, which I've just colored yellow here, we can count the total number of times each neuron fires an action potential or a spike. Now, normally we normalize this by the length of the time window because that gives us a spike rate, but I'm going to omit that for now. And what we want to do is borrow a technique that is very common in physics and engineering called state space analysis. And we start by instantiating what's called a state space. And all that means is that we create a plot like this, where each axis corresponds to the firing rate of 1 neuron. So here we have 3 neurons, so there are 3 axes. But of course, in most neuroscience studies, this is much higher dimensional. Now, in the state space, we can plot this data, which is actually just 1 time point. And it looks like so. We call this the neural population state, or the neural state, more simply. And what the state represents is what the whole population is doing at a particular point in time. So this is just 1 neural state, 1 time point. Here, let's look at more time points. So we have 4 time points here. So we're going to end up with 4 neural states. And if we plot all 4 of them together in the same state space and then connect them together, we get something called a neural trajectory, shown by this red here. Note that time is actually encoded along this trajectory itself. It's not on the x-axis, for example. So what's really interesting here is this geometry. But before we get too far, let's ground ourselves on what exactly we're doing. We're still very interested in linking brain to behavior, but we're no longer talking about what features of behavior correlate with neural activity. Instead, we're interested in understanding what drives the evolution of the neural activity over time to produce the behavior. So let's expand on that idea by being very precise about what we're plotting. So the neural states that I've been showing you are given by this x of t. And our goal is to understand how exactly this x of t evolves across time. So we need to look at its derivative, dx dt. Now, the particular laws or dynamics that cause the neural states to evolve through time are given by this nonlinear function f. And finally, we also consider the effect of external inputs. Note that these things are time varying. So this is the general and deterministic form for what's called a dynamical system. And here's my first disclaimer of the day. Simply saying that you can model neural activity as a dynamical system is not profound. What is potentially very profound is quantifying the precise nature of the dynamics, the nature of the inputs, and the resulting geometry. Said differently, these are the features that we will examine when we want to test very specific hypotheses. So the dynamics are what cause this trajectory to take a particular path through state space. And we can visualize that with something that's something known as a flow field, given by these green arrows here. And these basically describe how the neural population evolves through time. So how might this be helpful? Well, note that we cannot have the same neural trajectory for two different behaviors, even for simple things like reaching left versus right, which by the way is not a simple thing. But even for that, the trajectory has to be different. So how might the dynamical system deal with this? Well, let's start by looking at the flow field. Here's another one. And the dynamical system has something called an initial condition or a starting point. So let me show you two of them. Here's a purple one, and here's a magenta neural state. So now if we assign one of these neural states to leftward reaches and the second neural state to rightward reaches, turns out that will solve the problem for us, because based on those initializations and the underlying dynamics, you will get two very different neural trajectories, like so. Now, as a quick shameless plug, a lot of the work I did with Krishna during my PhD was discovering how motor learning involves systematic changes in these initial conditions. If that sounds interesting to you, feel free to check out these two papers here. Now, many of you might be wondering, is there a way to change these dynamics themselves? And indeed there is. One way to do that is by using what's called inputs. So these diamond-shaped dynamics that you're seeing on the left become more circular depending on the strength of the input that's coming in. In the review article, you can read more about what we're calling contextualizing a nonlinear system using inputs. Now, one of the most interesting and open questions in the field right now, at least in my opinion, is really understanding the nature of the local dynamics in a brain region and how those dynamics get changed or modified when you have inputs that come in from a variety of different places. Okay, so I've mostly been showing you 2- and 3-dimensional pictures, but turns out even if we recorded millions of neurons from the same brain region, due to correlations between neurons and perhaps some other interesting reasons, we find that this neural trajectory occupies a much lower dimensional space. And we can find this low D space using techniques called dimensionality reduction. So you end up with these latent factors, S1 and S2. Certainly dimensionality reduction is very good for visualization purposes, but there's also a very interesting relationship between these latent factors and where the dynamics themselves might operate, though that's still a very active area of research. And if you want to learn more about that, you can read this nice review by John Cunningham and Byron Yu, and in particular this LFADS paper by Chetan, David Cicillo, and others. Just one final point to keep in mind, this here does not need to be a hyperplane. In our annual reviews article, we discussed that your data can live in a variety of different low-D structures, which are embedded in the full high-dimensional space. Okay, so I've shown you a lot of cartoons, but do these things actually look so simple and well-behaved when we start looking at real neuroscience data? So here are various examples from studies I found just in the last year and a half. I'm not going to mention any one of these in particular, but perhaps you can appreciate that the seemingly complex single neuron responses that I showed you at the beginning of this talk are now being explained by relatively simple population level features. For example, this rotational structure during human speech. But here's my second disclaimer of the day. Our goal is not to make pictures like this. That's not a win. What we want to do instead is use the geometry and or the dynamics and inputs to really test specific hypotheses about the data. And indeed, the studies that I just showed you do meet that criteria. So to do all of these things, we've been studying this function f here, but we don't actually know what it is. I stated earlier that a good theory needed to respect network principles. So why don't we model this function f? Why don't we approximate it with a network, and in particular, a recurrent neural network, or an RNN? So I can replace this equation here now with another one that's actually very slightly different, where f is now given by this RNN R, which has parameters theta, which need to be learned from data. Turns out this is a really good idea because RNNs are what are known as universal approximators. And all that means is that you can approximate the true underlying function f here really, really well if you have enough data. You're going to hear a lot more about RNNs, including some of the methodology and the surrounding theory from Francesca in just a few moments. So I won't go into any of those details. However, in the last few moments, I want to tell you about one really powerful role that these RNNs serve in neuroscience, and that's hypothesis generation. So in this absolutely fantastic 2015 paper, David Cicillo trained RNNs to transform very simple inputs, which, by the way, you can think of like those initial conditions that I've been talking about, into complex spatiotemporally varying patterns of muscle activity. Now, amazingly, despite not being fit to any neural data whatsoever, this reproduces the single neuron responses. So on the left is the monkey data, and on the right is what the network does. Not only that, it also reproduces the population level features, these rotations. In fact, with the appropriate regularization, the underlying solution is almost always a low dimensional oscillator, despite subtle differences across RNNs. So it's worth taking a step back here and really appreciating how deeply profound this is, at least in my opinion. This allows us to commit to a very specific and very quantitative hypothesis for what we should be seeing in our data. And indeed, David could have done this entire study even before Mark Churchland recorded a single one of these neurons. As a field, we should and start doing much more of this moving forward. Another thing that RNNs allow us to do, which is actually nearly impossible to do experimentally, is manipulate the neural state essentially arbitrarily. What might happen if, for example, I go into the RNN and speed up these rotations? That's very nearly impossible to do in real brains, though stay tuned, we have been able to do that now. But in an RNN, you can do that much more easily. And really, that's why RNNs are so appealing, because training them to perform a hypothesized computation is often all you need to do in order to naturally account for the dominant features of both the single and the population level data. And this is really, really good because that gives us a great starting hypothesis. Moreover, we can perform just about any in silico perturbation we want, and that allows us to further interrogate these hypotheses and ultimately design better experiments. So I've told you and I've showed you a lot about what CTD is. So let me leave you with some final thoughts on what I think CTD is not. CTD is not a hypothesis, it's a framework. It is not eliminationist with respect to single cell features. It is not a fishing expedition. It's a framework to test and generate hypotheses at the level of networks. And finally, it is not meant to replace rigorous study of behavior. And with that, let me thank Matt Golub, David Cicillo, and Krishna Shenoy, who are the co-authors on this annual reviews piece and played an absolutely instrumental role. And I again want to thank Chetan for all of his wonderful hard work in organizing this wonderful meeting and giving me the opportunity to speak here today. And let me leave you with a few references from others on this topic, if you're interested. Thank you.
Excellent. Great work, Saurabh. Thank you so much for presenting that, sharing it with us, and magically you were still under 15 minutes, so I don't have to scowl at you. Well done. I'll just let everybody know we're gonna have the technical question and answer period at the end of these 3 talks. So we have some volunteers kind of trying to select questions from YouTube comments and that sort of thing, but I'll hold them off until after Francesca's talk. So let's go ahead and jump over to Abby in the interest of time.
You can see my slides. Okay.
Great, thank you.
All right, great. So hi, everyone. I want to start with a big thank you to the Simons-Emory consortium, especially Chetan, for putting together a very thoughtfully organized workshop. Today, I'm going to tell you about my thesis work with Mark Churchland, and I'm going to give you an overview of 2 projects in the motor system. But more than showing you the work itself, I hope to show you these projects simply as examples of how this computation through dynamics framework that Saurabh and others have laid out can be applied in the wild. So today I'm advocating for the study of generic properties of population activity structure, what I'll refer to as the geometry of population activity, as a tool for connecting our conceptual hypotheses of a brain region's computation with how that class of computation might be implemented by neural activity. And so the general idea of this workshop, as Saurabh described, is studying neural computation through studying neural dynamics. And so if we think neural dynamics are central to understanding neural computation, how do we study them? At least for now, we don't have the technology to actively explore neural state space and plot out something like this flow field, so the dynamics can't be directly observed. So what can we do? Well, if those dynamics are there, they'll leave their signature. There will be consistent structure in the population activity across times and conditions. And so if we see structure like this, we might hypothesize rotational dynamics. A rotational flow field is producing them. But what I hope to convince you of today is the utility of abstracting further, of taking inspiration from visualizing the population structure and cataloging different motifs, but not stopping there. So to help motivate the strategy, let me start with an analogy. So consider the goal of tying your shoes. Even for such a straightforward behavior, different people use different strategies. You may use a technique because it holds the strongest knot or simply because it's how you're taught. Now, imagine you're an alien who's come to Earth to study this behavior. You see the different knots people use, but you don't yet know the purpose of shoe tying. At first, you might think the knots were decorative. You might see that most laces are white and think this is a key property of their function. If you only observe the most common strategy, you might develop an overly elaborate hypothesis for why that one strategy is the correct one. In fact, only by observing several failure modes, say someone tripping over undone laces or struggling to untie a difficult knot, would you understand that a good solution holds the knot, but a great one is also easy to untie. And so by comparing many strategies, you can more deeply understand the goal of shoe tying, which parameters matter, and the more subtle properties that make a good technique. And so bringing this back to neuroscience, when we're trying to understand the alien world of the brain, I think we can learn a lot by comparing solutions across individuals and identifying commonalities across a family of solutions that may even use different dynamics to produce them. I think Eve Marder's work is a beautiful example of the utility of comparing individual solutions. She and her group have shown that the same circuit behavior, the pyloric rhythm, can be implemented by different circuit parameters across individuals. And it seems clear that if there's implementation variability in circuits where we know all the neurons by name, there's certain to be variability in networks where neurons outnumber their outputs by the millions. And so if there's a massive solution space, the question becomes, of all the conceivable solutions, which are viable, which are used by the brain, and why? In other words, what are the high-level properties of a good solution? And so today I'll argue that the emerging strategy of identifying common geometric properties, quantitative generic measures of population structure, is a useful tool for answering these questions. And I think the real power of this level of study comes from its generality. I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but the metrics I'll show you from my work today are generic in the sense that they don't depend on any aspect of the task. They can be applied to any time-varying neural data set, regardless of the behavior, and can even be applied to data with or without dimensionality reduction. This is nice because it frees the experimenter from having to make some arbitrary choices. But more than that, as I'll show you later in the talk, this generality facilitates comparisons across individuals, but also data sets of many types, which can allow us to test the generalizability of our hypotheses, which at the end of the day is what we really care about. So I'm going to start by telling you about my work in primary motor cortex. I'll start by showing you a couple mysterious aspects of population structure and then describing a geometric property that both explains the structure and allows us to investigate our hypothesis. And then we'll go in the other direction, starting with a hypothesis about the class of computation performed by another brain region, the SMA, the supplementary motor area, and describing how that hypothesis would manifest in geometry and structure. And so to ask these general questions about the computation of motor cortex, we wanted a task that would generate complex, robust patterns of activity in neurons and muscles. And so we trained monkeys to grasp a hand pedal and cycle through a virtual environment and stop intermittently on visual targets. And so taking a look at some single unit PSTHs, 3 example muscles and 4 neurons, we see that we do get rich, robust patterns of neural and muscle activity. So far though, no real dramatic difference between these data sets pops out. They both have rhythmic activity with repeating middle cycles and complex responses with some harmonic features. But when we move to the level of the population, we start to see some interesting differences. So now I'm plotting the projection onto the first two principal components for two conditions, forward cycling in green and backward cycling in red. And from this view, neural activity looks quite different from muscle activity. This is surprising because you might reasonably expect that if the goal of motor cortex is to generate muscle activity, the biggest signals in the data should look like muscles. But rather, the neural activity is much more circular and rotates in the same direction across conditions, rather where the muscle activity counter rotates. And we wondered if these properties might be related to one another and might even reflect a more general fundamental difference between these data sets. And we hypothesized that the goal of motor cortex is indeed to produce patterns of muscle activity, but from this computation through dynamics framework, there are some constraints on what solutions are viable. Specifically, trajectories that are tangled, that cross over themselves in state space or nearly crossover, will be difficult to produce. And the intuition here is that if neural activity is driven by dynamics, then moments like these are problematic because the next state can't simply be a function of the previous state. You would need additional inputs or signals to distinguish them. And even if the trajectories don't precisely cross, if a tangled trajectory were to be produced by a flow field, the flow field would have to be very non-smooth and thus sensitive to noise. So you can see any small change here would knock you to the inappropriate part of the flow field. This general point is actually pretty intuitive. Say you have a network of 10,000 interconnected neurons and you need their activity as a population to be totally different depending on whether or not one neuron is 10% more active. That'd probably be really hard to build, and also really sensitive to noise. And so we wondered whether these seemingly unrelated aspects of population structure might all serve the same purpose as a general solution to this problem of tangling. And indeed, when we measured tangling in these data sets, we found that tangling was high in muscle activity and low in both empirical motor cortical data and in networks trained to produce muscle activity during this task. We also found that motor cortical activity during a different task, a reaching task, as well as motor cortical activity in the mouse was characterized by low tangling. By contrast, activity in somatosensory cortex during our original task and neural activity in visual cortex during natural movie viewing were both characterized by high tangling. And these findings are consistent with the interpretation that low tangling is indicative of activity that's driven by dynamics rather than by inputs. And one natural question here is, do we think motor cortex is autonomous? Surely it's influenced by somatosensory and visual feedback. And of course, motor cortex is influenced by feedback, especially in our task where movement can last for several seconds. But the key here is that the feedback in our task is predictable and can thus be incorporated into the dynamics. The monkeys are well trained, they're making very few errors. But you can imagine other cases where motor cortex would have to react to unexpected, unpredictable feedback, say from motor errors or external perturbation. In those cases, we might expect motor cortex to be influenced more by inputs, and under this framework, that would translate to higher tangling. And in fact, that was shown to be the case in a recent paper from Matt Perrick and colleagues. They found that motor cortex during motor errors, during grasps that needed to be corrected, showed higher tangling. So I just told you about my work in motor cortex. We saw how the biggest signals in neural data were initially mysterious, but easy to explain from this perspective of geometry. And now I want to show you how this framework can be applied in the reverse direction, starting with the hypothesis and moving towards predictions of geometry and population structure. And so there's a large and fascinating literature on the supplementary motor area. SMA has been implicated in many higher order aspects of motor control, such as bilateral coordination, voluntary initiation of movement, timing, sensory motor mapping, and sequencing, and so on. And so we wondered if in our cycling task, SMA might also have a higher order, more cognitive role and might guide movement over long time scales. So to address that hypothesis, we leverage an aspect of our task, which is that for different conditions, monkeys had to pedal different distances in the virtual world, either 7 cycles, 4, 2, or 1, depending on how far away the visual target was at the start of the trial. And we noticed that structure in motor cortex, while useful for pattern generation, is not conducive for guiding movement over long time scales. And so here's that motor cortical activity during a single 7-cycle condition. It's the same data we were looking at before, but now we're looking in 3 dimensions and it's colored to indicate the passage of time. And you can see that the motor cortical activity enters this limit cycle, this orbit, and stays here until the end of movement. And we suppose that this structure would not be conducive to guiding movement over long timescales because essentially the structure doesn't distinguish between cycles. Said another way, the trajectory repeats itself a number of times and then eventually diverges off of the limit cycle. And so our intuition is that structure like this is not conducive for guiding movement over long timescales. So next we wanted to check that intuition and also ask, what might we expect structure to look like in networks that do guide movement over long timescales? And so to give us some inspiration, we turned to artificial network models. We considered two families of networks. The first network receives both a starting input and a stopping input and has to generate a cyclic output. And the second type of network receives only a starting input and has to generate the same output but stop autonomously. And what we saw is that these networks had dramatically different population structure. The quote unquote naive networks had structure that looked quite a bit like the motor cortical activity, but the tracking networks looked quite different. And in fact, we see that different initializations of these models come up with different solutions. And I'll note that there are some interesting and potentially meaningful differences between these implementations across networks, but they do share a sort of familial resemblance. One way or another, they all share this geometric feature that they keep the cycles separate. And so we quantified this structure with a geometric property we call divergence, which we believe is necessary to enable a network to guide movement over long time scales. And we found that indeed the difference between these networks was characterized by a difference in divergence, as was the difference in structure between motor cortex and the supplementary motor area. So here's that SMA structure in 2 monkeys compared to the motor cortical structure in 2 monkeys. And so I just gave you a very high level overview of my thesis work in M1 and SMA. And before I wrap up, I want to show you what these metrics actually look like. I don't have time to walk through them with as much care as I'd like, but I just wanted to make it clear what I mean when I say we designed these metrics to be generic. You can see they only depend on neural activity X and are just a function of how neural activity is structured with respect to itself across times and conditions. And I think this generality is a real asset because once you've defined a metric that captures the hypothesis you're interested in, you can apply it to any task, to any data set where you think that class of computation is required. You can even apply it to full population data sets without doing dimensionality reduction. And even though implementation may vary across individuals or even depend on the task, you can still recognize the computation class at a high level. And this ultimately allows you to test how well your hypothesis generalizes, which is really what we care about anyway. Which brings me to the biggest downside of this level of study, which is its generality. It's 2 sides of the same coin. So these metrics can speak to the class of computation, but not to the precise implementation strategy. Taking the SMA models as example, as I alluded to earlier, there was variation in how the model networks achieved low divergence. And that variability could be really interesting and meaningful. And even from first principles, we don't know if the supplementary motor area is tracking cycles itself via dead reckoning, or if it's inheriting that information from another region or some combination of these 2 strategies. We even trained up 2 families of tracking networks to model these 2 possibilities, one type that inherited a ramp-like input and another that did not. And both strategies were viable and both produced low divergence solutions. So really to learn more about the details of implementation, you'd need to rely on more targeted analyses or clever behavioral tasks, because from the level of population geometry, different strategies could look the same. And with that, I'd like to thank Mark and the lab, my collaborators on this work, sources of funding, and again, Simons-Emory for this wonderful opportunity.
All right, thank you, Abby. Great work. It was really wonderful to see those 2, really informative and complementary studies, laid out, and great job compressing that all into 15 minutes. Francesca, you can go ahead and load up your slides. So thanks again, Abby. And just a reminder for everyone, obviously at the end of this, we're not going to have time to get to everybody's questions. I know there are a ton of them. We'll do our best. So, all right, go ahead, Francesca.
Can you see the slides?
That's great.
Okay. Okay, so as the 2 previous talks have beautifully illustrated, the framework of computations through dynamics is it suggests that one can get an handle about the algorithms which underlie computation into the brain by analyzing how the dynamics which is generated by neural circuit looks like. And thanks to the recent advances in technology, we can do this at the level of a large population of neurons. And so dynamics is visualized in the high-dimensional state space, where populations span trajectories which are smooth and nicely low-dimensional, even if at the level of single neurons, these data sets are highly complex and hard to understand. And so in this perspective, understanding computations means to point out the projections of these trajectories, which seem relevant for a given task. So if dynamics really reflects a given computation, then different tasks might require very different dynamics. And so the question which comes to mind is, what kind of dynamics can actually neural circuits implement, and how do they do that? And this is a non-trivial question because, as it was already said, neural circuits are not generic, arbitrary dynamical systems, but they have to obey some biophysical constraints. And probably the most obvious one is that neural circuits consist of a finite number of discrete units, which are the neurons. And these neurons, at least up to a very first, very rough approximation, they are fairly simple nonlinear devices which transform their input currents into their output firing rates through fixed and stereotyped nonlinear functions. So one way of quantifying what I just said is to say that if we want to describe this neural circuit as a dynamical system, then we need to write a dynamical system where the variables are more than one. And so I can put all the activation variables of all the neurons together in a big, in a tall vector, X. And the right-hand side of this dynamical equation comes in a specific form. So the first term is just a Lick term, which says that these neurons have a firing rate which will decay to baseline if there are no inputs. Then there can be external inputs, and the interactions between neurons in the same circuit, which is this term here, is nonlinear because neurons are rectifying the input currents that they receive. And the interactions are specified by this connectivity matrix W, which is a big matrix, which is modeling the synaptic connections between pairs of neurons. And so even if this function phi is fixed, this dynamical system can implement different dynamics by changing the entries of this big connectivity matrix, where every pixel of this matrix corresponds to the synaptic strength between a pair of neurons, I and J. So if we want to understand what kind of dynamics can this model implement, we need to address two questions. The first one is, for a given target dynamics, can we think of a connectivity matrix which will do the job? And the second question, which is more a reverse engineering one, is how does it work? That is, how is this connectivity structure interacting with the dynamics of single neurons to generate collective dynamics? Now, although thinking about neural circuits in this way, as you have seen, it recently inspired a beautiful line of experimental studies, this kind of dynamical systems in this form are not new to neuroscience at all. In fact, they have been the subject of study of many people in theoretical neuroscience in the last 40 years. And the question these people had in mind was exactly the same one we are asking today, that is, how should neural circuitry work if they want to generate some dynamics which is suitable for a given computation. So let's go through a simple example, which is a network model for perceptual decision-making task, which is the classic random dots task, where subjects are presented with some unreliable, noisy sensory evidence, which in this case consists of dots, where only part of these dots are moving in a coherent direction. And the task is to integrate these inputs to remove the noise and just spot the direction of coherent motion. So one very popular model which implements this task is as follows. It consists of many neurons, of excitatory and inhibitory ones. And part of the excitatory neurons are grouped together in two populations, which are strongly connected through excitatory synapses. And these neurons in these two populations are selective for one direction of motion or the other, because they receive the sensory input, which is modeling the noisy evidence for one direction or the other. Now, the fact that these two populations are connected with a population of inhibitory neuron is somehow creating some competition between these two populations, which leads to a slow reverberation of these inputs through the recurrent dynamics. In other terms, these inputs go through an approximate line attractor, which allow the network to denoise the input and to trigger a decision. So for example, if the dots are coherently moving to the left, what will happen is that the activity of all the neurons in the left population will ramp up, while the other neurons will stay at baseline. So this class of models were addressing together both our understanding questions, the engineering and the reverse engineering one, because these models tell us how we should pick a connectivity matrix. In fact, you can easily recast this simple circuit model into a connectivity matrix where there are two subsets of excitatory neurons which are more strongly connected together. And the fact that this connectivity matrix is very simple and we know how to describe it in words, in mathematical terms, we know that there's going to be only a few parameters which will matter, allow us also to understand how this circuit works. And this is very important, especially if we want to abstract from this theoretical model and go back to neural circuits in terms of a few quantities which do have a biophysical counterpart. Also, this class of classical models, importantly, were able to capture some non-trivial feature of the data, such as in this specific example, the fact that it was observed that many neurons in LIP were showing ramping up behavior in their firing rates. Okay, so overall, this approach has led to great discoveries, and it works very well, but it comes with two drawbacks. The first obvious problem is that in neural circuits which are large, connectivity matrices are fairly high-dimensional objects, and so there's a limit to how much we can push our intuition to start to keep on designing by hand how pairs of neurons should be connected together. And what happens typically is that if you consider a slightly more complex task here, for example, if you extend the random dots task to the context-dependent variant where the stimuli are two-dimensional, there's no way of generalizing the previous model to include this kind of complexity in the model. The second problem is that these kind of models seem to fail to capture one fundamental feature of the data, that is the fact that single neurons activity look complex and heterogeneous in many high-level cortical areas at least. And this is due to the fact that in these classical models, neurons were grouped together in populations according to their selectivity properties, and neurons in the same population had extremely similar activity profiles. So when neurons in the left population were ramping up, all the other neurons were doing exactly the same thing. And this seems to be at odds with what you observe in many brain areas, such as here in PFC. And so how do we address our understanding questions, the engineering, the reverse engineering one in those cases? Okay, so concerning the first question, the approach has been to use numerical techniques to directly optimize all specific entries of this big connectivity matrix. And you can do this in two ways. In some cases, you might have a good guess about what the target dynamics for a given network should be. So in that case, you can train W on a target dynamics. But if you don't have any guess, you just want to generate hypotheses, then you can train W in the same way you would train a subject or a monkey. And there's plenty of techniques for doing that. Now, despite some little problems, not really little, such as biological plausibility and Dale's law, these techniques are really effective. And this is based on the fact that RNN have been shown to be able to approximate very complex dynamics. And this approach also solves the other issues that we had, because if you look at how activity of these networks look like, single neurons seem to retain the complexity and heterogeneity, which is typically observed in neural data. So now we have a connectivity matrix W. Can we link this connectivity to the dynamics which will emerge in this class, in these networks? Now, this question is in general hard, especially in nonlinear networks, which display a lot of counterintuitive behaviors. And it was already non-trivial in classical models where connectivity matrices were nice and homogeneous. And we could describe them in a bunch of parameters. And we knew that those were the parameters which actually had a strong impact on the dynamics, which was relevant for the task. When you train a network instead, you typically end up with a connectivity matrix, which looks like this. That is a connectivity matrix which almost looks like noise. And it's not even clear whether there is or there is not in these matrices some simple structure that we should try to extract and understand. Now, if there is such a structure, of course, we even don't know what are the parameters which are governing this structure and what will be the effect of these parameters on neural activity. And this is a problem because this essentially makes it impossible to compare these popular big class of models with all the models which have been generated until now, and also makes it very hard to connect this class of models to finally to neural circuits. So more in general, even if you have trained an RNN, it works, and neural activity is heterogeneous as it is in the brain. It's very hard in this class of models to disentangle which are the features of this neural activity, which are key for a given computation, and which are the features which are just there because of noise or because of the specific algorithm that we have chosen. And that's a pity because there's a lot of biological ingredients that we would like to test, such as what is the effect on computations of low-dimensional dynamics, CI balance, and mixed selectivity. So the hypothesis that we have been investigating during my PhD is that these matrices might be simpler than they look like if we find a proper way of disentangling this complexity. And the factorization that we propose looks like this. We suggest that a complex connectivity matrices actually might be understood if we find a way of writing them as a sum of multiple terms. So the first term is just noise. This is noise which is not tuned during learning. So it's really noise which is agnostic with respect to any task. And then on top of this, we have the plastic part of the connectivity, which is which is reshaped by the task, which comes in a specific form. And this specific form is a sum of a bunch of rank 1 matrices. And we typically have only few of them so that overall this part of the connectivity is low rank. A rank 1 matrix is a very simple matrix where all the rows and all the columns are proportional one to each other. And they can be written as external products between two vectors, which is what I call M and N. So why did we look at this class of matrices? Well, already in classical networks, there were some networks which were relying on this kind of matrices, which suggested that even if they are simple matrices, still they can implement complex or non-trivial dynamics in neural circuits. And also surprisingly, in many of the frameworks which we use every day for optimization and training, there's a lot of them which return a connectivity matrix, which takes this form, both in an implicit or an explicit form. And this suggests that this kind of structure might in fact be a good candidate to try to capture what's going on in these complicated matrices, because these are the structures which naturally emerge over learning, at least in an artificial setup. So what is the advantage of assuming this decomposition? Well, the advantage is that the connection between connectivity and dynamics becomes highly transparent because the mathematics become tractable. And despite the fact that we have simplified the matrix, these matrices can still retain some complex task-relevant dynamics and also retain the fact that single neurons activity is complex and heterogeneous. So how can we understand non-trivial dynamics, even if single neuron activity is very complicated? Well, you will see in a second that in this framework, we can very naturally apply the same trick that experimentalists use, that is to zoom out of single neurons and just think of this network at the population level. So why is this true? Let's consider a very simple example where I'm forgetting this noise term and just keeping these two terms, right? And let's look at how, assuming that the connectivity takes this form, will shape network dynamics. So let's start with the dynamical equations that we derive at the beginning. And let's replace W with a rank 2 matrix, which is written in terms of these 4 vectors up here. Now we can expand this product and we get these multiplicative terms where this part here is a dot product. So it's a scalar product between two very high dimensional vectors, which just give a scalar. And these two scalars, I'm going to call them Z1 and Z2. So what is the consequence of having a dynamics in this form? The consequence is that if you look at the directions in the high dimensional state space in which X is living, where X can actually change, this will be given by the directions which are specified by the right-hand side of these equations. And so they will be given by these two vectors, M1 and M2, which are the two vectors that we use to define the connectivity. So this implies that the trajectories that the dynamics X will span will be restricted to live in a small subportion of this high dimensional space, which is essentially the plane spanned by M1 and M2. And the precise shape that this dynamics will take will be given by these two coordinates, Z1 and Z2, which define the coordinates along these two vectors, M1 and M2. And so what we do is to use the theory to compute these two coordinates, which will contain the effect of these two vectors, N1 and 2, which disappeared from these equations. So at this point, we can ask, well, how do we generate these vectors, M1 and 1, M2 and 2? And the key insight is that once you think at the population level, you can, there's no reason to believe that the entries of these vectors have to be nice and homogeneous, but in fact, you can just draw them from any probability distribution. And this will imply that if you look at any single rows of this dynamical system, which quantifies the rate of change of activity for a single neuron, this right-hand side will contain a sum of two random numbers, which in fact is a random number itself, which implies that activity of single neurons will be kicked in very different directions, which will generate highly heterogeneous activity despite the fact that the neural trajectory looks very smooth and in fact is extremely low dimensional and simple. Okay, so let me wrap up. We started with a question, what dynamics can neural circuits implement and how do they do that? And I've argued that at least in network models, this boils down to find a connection between connectivity, synaptic connectivity, and emergent dynamics. This connection is very transparent in classical network models. It's less so in more recent models, which are obtained through optimization. And I've suggested that one possible way to start understanding these complicated models is to factorize the connectivity matrix through a low-rank expansion, which is a way of retaining interesting dynamics and heterogeneous single activity, but gaining some understanding. So I would like to thank Chetan for having been an amazing organizer. And also this work was started during my PhD in Paris. So I'd like to thank my supervisor, Sergeant, for his guidance throughout all these years and all the other people who have greatly contributed to the project. Thank you very much.
Really wonderful. Thank you so much, Francesca. Okay, so, everybody watching over YouTube, I think I found that it was quite a treat to see, this amazing breadth from people who are, I think, are going to be rising stars in this field. It was really wonderful. Thank you for putting this together. So as I mentioned, we've got a brief question and answer period, so we'll have 15 minutes now. We're not going to be able to get to everybody, but we'll try our best. So I'm going to take some liberties a little bit, and we have some volunteers who are doing a great job of kind of scouring YouTube comments for questions. So there are two questions that I'm kind of going to merge together here. One from Flip Sabes and one from Kyle Poe. And I think they're both kind of about our basic assumptions when we take neural data and try to create a state space model. And we typically look at firing rates. So one of the things Flip mentions is what is the state? Are we missing something? And the particular example he gave is the idea of momentum, which may be important, but we might not be capturing with sort of the models that were described. And different but related question, I think, from Kyle Poe is, given the discrete nature of neural time series, and I think here discrete means, spiking activity, if effectively 0 or 1, in what rigorous sense can neural trajectories truly be understood to be smooth, other than as an artifact of convolution with smooth kernels? So I'm going to go ahead and let's start with Saurabh. Do you want to give us some thoughts on
that? Sure. I guess the first question regarding momentum, I mean, I think CTD, or this entire perspective, as I mentioned before, is just a framework. Is there another level of abstraction that you could put on those axes instead of firing rates? Sure. We measure spikes and action potentials in experiments. And I think one of the assumptions that we made, which I guess we often rarely talk about in reviews and papers, is why did we put firing rates on those axes? And I think that's a much longer discussion, which I would love to have perhaps at another time. But I think for now, at least what I'll say is we made that assumption because we measure spikes. So let's see how well we do. Can you explain single neuron responses that way? Can you explain the population that way? Can you explain behavior that way? And so on, as I said during my talk. And turns out in many situations we can. So we sort of just ran with that. But that doesn't mean that you can't have other levels of abstraction. You can't have other variables like momentum and so on.
Great. And maybe Abby, I probably want to get your opinion on this too, because I think, the concept of momentum might specifically affect how we think about tangling and divergence. So do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I've gotten that question. Yeah, that was probably directed, might have been directed at the tangling story. And I think the way I'd like to respond is basically by saying that, the examples that I gave, maybe some examples of tangling could be solved by including neural momentum in the equation. But tangling isn't just, crisscrossing in state space. It could be, two trajectories that are following the same path and going in completely opposite directions. It can be trajectories moving at different speeds. There's a lot of instances where the general problem of tangling could crop up. And the only general solution is to just avoid it altogether. And, there's, as kind of Saurabh, I think, was getting at, you can come up with different solutions to the problem of tangling, but it's about kind of the general question, looking at the neural data, why does it look like that to begin with? I mean, we didn't come up with the tangling hypothesis before. We really were looking at the data and pondering over these features that didn't seem to match previous hypotheses for what motor cortex was up to. So it seemed a natural framework.
Yeah, that's great. And I appreciate those responses. And I think kind of in line with those, just when we're doing this, we have to pick some level of abstraction. And this appears to be capturing a lot of features and maybe, shedding light on some questions that were hard to answer with other approaches. So I really appreciate that. Related, do either of you have thoughts on kind of the relationship between discrete spikes and smooth firing rates?
I mean, Abby, you can talk about smoothness as it relates to tangling and noise robustness, and maybe that more or less gets at that question.
Yeah, well, I think for the data that we were looking at, the muscle activity and the neural activity were smooth in the same way. It's clear that it's not a difference between muscle activity and, the neural activity in visual cortex and the neural activity in somatosensory cortex. The difference we're seeing in tangling can't certainly be explained by those kinds of choices, at least.
Great. I'll maybe just add that, again, we have to pick a level of abstraction. And at least when we do things like, we have repeated trials, whether it's a sensory area and we have repeated trials of the same stimulus, or a motor area and we have repeated trials of the same condition, movement condition, for sure there are things we're missing with a firing rate approximation, but firing rates do seem to be a really robust feature across repeated trials of the same condition. So it seems like a good starting point, I would say.
I'll just quickly add that, again, the computation through dynamics, even though we've said, we're looking at firing rate changes over time and everything Chetan said and Abby said hold, I think it would be very interesting to look at other variables and see if similar principles could be at work. Because at the end of the day, if our goal is to link brain and behavior, we need to be able to explain brain and behavior. And I think the framework is somewhat general and it has certain drawbacks, as Abby mentioned during her talk, but I think there's nothing stopping people from trying that. And I think that's wonderful and very exciting.
Great. And by the way, any panelists, feel free to jump in if you'd like to add. I'll move on to a question from Daniel O'Shea. And Dan, I think this is also, Abby, kind of related to your talk. So Dan says, using tangling as a metric for input-driven seems to depend on the states of the inputs, though. If the inputs are not tangled themselves, it wouldn't necessarily create tangling in motor cortex.
That's certainly true. Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I think of inputs in motor cortex, I mean, the inputs can come in many different flavors. And I think Saurabh was getting at this in his talk as well. But, inputs can come in, in the flavor of totally changing the dynamics of the system completely. They can come in the flavor of, inputs as we maybe think of in terms of visual cortex being kind of the main driver of activity. That's, visual cortex maybe is just receiving these inputs and trying to extract information from them, and that's the main role. In motor cortex, I think it's a little less clear. I think, these inputs could come in many different, varieties, influencing, say, the speed of the movement and the way that Saurabh was describing, kind of changing the dynamics of the system as a whole. In that case, they probably wouldn't influence tangling. But there's certainly other cases like, an unexpected bump to the hand, where the system would have to react to it, or if the animal had to track, a stimulus on a screen or something like this, where the motor system was really heavily influenced by these unpredictable inputs. Those are the types of inputs that I would expect would influence tangling.
Thanks, agreed. So here's one that's, I think, a little bit different than the previous questions, from Dieter Jaeger, who's here at Emory. Dieter asks, LFP oscillations are a big topic in experimental studies of neural interactions. Where do they fit with these state space models? Tough question. Anybody want to take a crack at it? Well, while y'all are thinking about a response, and Saurabh, I'm going to call on you next because you had, let us off. I'll just mention, in our LFADS paper where we do apply some of these same approaches, we did notice that when we tried to describe the firing rates of neurons on single trials, we do see activity that seems to correspond with the oscillations that we also record in LFP. So we know that spiking activity is often synchronous with LFP, and it certainly, when you try to describe the firing rates of neurons precisely, you do seem to pull out those features as well. How that actually links, oscillations to the state space framework, I don't personally have a good answer for that. I'd love to hear one if anybody has one.
I don't know. I feel like I sound like a broken record at this point, but if we believe that the measurement that we make from the brain is a reasonable one, at the end of the day, we just want to explain those measurements, right? And LFPs are time varying. They capture some relevant aspect of the response, hopefully to some behavior that we're studying. And I think, honestly, a lot of these methods, they need to be tested in with different data streams. Does it work well with LFPs? I mean, the answer is I personally don't know. I haven't done it. I was going to throw this back to Chetan because they do mention it during LFADS, but he's He anticipated my response. But I don't view this, I mean, my personal view on this is that there's so many exciting things to try with this framework that we should go try them. And we often, when we do these primate experiments, we have access to LFPs. Certainly, from Krishna's group, Sergei Stavitsky has looked at those in the context of brain-machine interfaces and so on. And I think, yeah, one should definitely try out these techniques and see how well they do or do not work.
All right, thanks, Saurabh. Thanks for taking on the hardest question there. Okay, a question, I think this one is for Francesca from Johnny Lunsel. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Given a sufficiently large number of recorded neurons, would we expect to find subsystems captured? And how can we tease them apart or quantify how much a given subset of neurons are joined together?
So is the question about trying to infer a model from the data? Or it's about the model itself? I guess I'm a bit confused by the question.
Yeah, and I might have misinterpreted it as being directed to your talk, but I think the relationship there was, or at least to me, was sort of when you showed us the Wong and Wong model and how there is an explicit kind of set of neurons that you might think of as forming a subsystem. So do we expect that to be a general property? And how can we quantify how much a given subset of neurons is joined together?
Okay, so with respect to that specific model, it's kind of simple because these subpopulations are defined in terms of the inputs that they receive. So since neurons are defined by their selectivity properties, there are some neurons which receive the evidence for one direction, the other neurons receive evidence for the other directions. And so the model suggests that maybe if you couple these neurons more strongly together, you get a proper dynamics. So in that case, it's nicely indicated by the anatomy, how these populations are defined. I'm not sure this addresses the question. I haven't talked about any sort of populations and more complex structure in more complicated models. But there's also the fact which relates to that we use models which are rate models where sometimes we implicitly assume that one variable X is just one neuron, but we don't need to do that, right? It's very possible that one variable X corresponds to a column or a subset of neurons which are very synchronized. They have firing rates which are highly coupled. And so it's very, very tricky to connect these models to neural data. And I will say that if we like the idea that these RNN are modeling the circuits, which I agree, I think they are a good approximation, or at least it's the simplest approximation we can do, then it's not clear that one unit is one neuron. It's also possible that it's a group of neurons.
Thanks, absolutely. It seems potentially very unlikely that one RNN unit would correspond to one neuron in the brain, essentially. Okay, and then I think we have a great question from Megan Carey, but also some others. So a few people have raised the question about whether phenomena like rotations are less likely to be observed in less constrained and particularly non-rotational tasks. So I'll throw that out there to the entire group.
I mean, I showed an example of rotations present during human speech, which isn't a rotational task.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. And I think, much of the original Churchland, with John and Krishna work was point-to-point reaching or curve reaching with it. I wouldn't necessarily call any of those a rotational task. I think it's a great question to try to understand what we expect to see in unconstrained behaviors. I think that's honestly a bit of a frontier, but the fact that we see them so robustly in different behaviors, going from arm reaching to speech to cycling, seems to indicate that we're likely to see them more broadly.
I mean, also Abby should chime in here, but really the tangling work is a beautiful example of not focusing too much on the precise form of the dynamics that we see, but rather a circle has the lowest amount of tangling. And that makes sense for all the reasons. I mean, Abby, you should chime in. I mean, you're here.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you said it, Sarab. I mean, I think that to me is the benefit of moving to the more abstract quantifications of population structure, because yeah, maybe in a reaching task, rotations are the best way to implement low tangling. My task is rotational, so it's a little hard, to really answer that question here. But there's other ways, even in my task that is rotational, that the neural activity seems to avoid tangling. I didn't get to talk about it very much, but for conditions that were maybe incompatible, the forward versus backward pedaling, there was that counter rotation in the muscles. And the neural activity, apart from using a co-rotational strategy, it also puts those conditions into somewhat orthogonal dimensions. So, it seems like there's these different motifs, the non-coplanar, the circularity in my task, and the co-rotationality, that all kind of are the ways that low tangling manifests in this task, which it does happen to be rotational. And maybe in a reaching task, briefer movements, that circularity shows up again, just because it's a really good strategy for maintaining low tangling. So it's possible, but I mean, yeah, I think the speech example is a really cool one, and just kind of continuing to look at different tasks and behaviors and testing these ideas are the real answer.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Abby. So I think that's about all the time we have for this Q&A period, but remember there's more later, so I hope people will keep a lively discussion going in the YouTube comments, and thank you very much to the volunteers who are trying to sift through this wonderful discussion that's happening right now. So go ahead, and we're going to switch to the more discussion-oriented part of our workshop, but we'll start off with Mehrdad Jazayeri from MIT, who will give us will tell us a little bit about how dynamics can be thought of to study cognition, and also connecting neural computation to algorithms. Mehrdad, I think you're muted.
Yeah, let me see how this will work. I can just go to sharing portion of the screen. Maybe that will work. Let's see.
Right now we see a very small amount of your slides.
Do you see now the full slide?
That looks great.
Okay, everyone. So yeah, thanks for this program. It's fun. It's thought-provoking. It kept me up till like 2 a.m. last night thinking about what do I want to tell you guys about cognition, which there's several problems with that. I don't understand cognition, and actually we don't understand how to think about cognition in terms of neurons. And but it was fun. It's sort of just it's exactly this forum, and you've done a fantastic job putting this together. So thank you for that. What I will be doing is more kind of a stream of consciousness kind of a talk. I will use some of the ideas that was presented earlier as computation through dynamics. But the problem is that if we want to go down the path of cognition, we got to take cognition seriously, and that's a hard problem. So I'll tell you some thoughts I have on that. So let's start by first, as everybody else here said, we really want to understand the relationship between the brain and behavior. And, since the past 50, 60 years or even more, we've been thinking in terms of behavior as some form of computing something about the sensory inputs and providing outputs. So the proxy for behavior has been computation. On the other side, we have brain, which are, at some level of abstraction, a group of neurons interacting with one another, and that generates dynamics. So one of the things that has been the situation here is that as a proxy for trying to connect the brain to behavior, we thought that maybe the right way to think about this is to try to understand computation, which is a proxy for behavior, to dynamics, which is a proxy for how the brain works. And that's really the heart of the computation through dynamics, which there was great discussions about what it means, what it is not, how do you kind of construct it with circuits and things of that kind. But I was tasked to tell you about cognitive behavior and cognitive computations. So what is actually cognition? I am not entirely sure we can agree on that, so I'm going to put some groundworks here so we can actually be concretely talking about this. So I'll say cognition is about learning abstract knowledge and using abstract knowledge to make inferences about data that is sparse, uncertain, and ambiguous. That's really the key to making rich inferences about something that is hard. That's the magic of cognition, really. And the idea of being able to do this is fairly simple. It goes back to the philosophy of induction. The bottom line is that you have to come up with some form of strategy to reduce the space of possibilities, because the data is just not sufficient to tell you what's going on. So you need some constraints. And now the statisticians will call it priors, machine learning people will call it inductive biases, and linguists will call it constraints. Bottom line is that you need some form of reducing the dimensionality, the degrees of freedom. And to do that, you need some form of an internal model of the outside world. And if you have an internal model of the outside world, then what you can do is use that with the limited data that you have, which then will be some form of cognitive computation that then you make rich inferences from. So as soon as we think about internal models, then we have no choice but to think about what is actually inside that model. We can't just call it an internal model and call it a day. And the problem is that internal models they're not a thing. Like there's not a thing that immediately you know what they are. They deal with data structures, and the idea of having a model is that that model allows you to intervene on those data structures and do things with them, like inference, okay? So then the question really is, what are these data structures? And inference is not a one-shot problem. You have statistical inference, you have relational inference, causal inference, social inference, structural inference, and it's not quite clear that the data structure for all of these ought to be exactly the same. So internal models that operates for these different types of inference we might have to consider different things. So, for example, for statistical inference, something that we have studied in the lab and others have done is that, maybe the types of things that we've been talking about in the morning with low dimensional state spaces and, characteristics that will allow some, graded variable, a scalar variable or a few dimensional variable to be represented in a way that affords statistical inference is a good way. But then, you think about relational inference, if you talk to somebody, a cognitive neuroscientist, then they will be thinking about, hierarchical trees. So where is that then in this space that we're thinking about is a little bit more challenging to think about. And then if you think about causal inference, then you have, probabilistic graphs, that these are sort of the structure of the data that you have a model over, and therefore you might be able to use it, or at least a suitable way of thinking about it is to think about these different types of data structures. So we have these different types of data structures, and therefore we have to kind of be thinking about cognition in terms of these data structures and intervening on these data structures. Now let's move back to the brain and dynamics, right? So where are these data structures? Basically, the morning kind of leaves us with is that when we think about the brain, we're really thinking about a group of neurons that have some connections to one another. Let's call that the weight space, W space here. And then they generate activity patterns, and let's call that the A space, which is the state space of activities. And what we're looking for really when we're thinking about cognition are abstractions away from these weight space and activity spaces that would lead us to those data structures, right? That's really what we're looking at, right? And there's been a lot of work in this domain, although not necessarily put in this framework. So abstractions about the weight space, we talk about brain regions, that's partitioning the weight space. We talk about cortical microcircuits. If there is some repeating microcircuit, that actually is reducing the degrees of freedom of the weight space. And there are, now with all the perturbation theories, there is a sort of panoply of circuits for every type of behavior. And those are also trying to reduce the the space of possibilities going from synapses to some level of abstraction. And in the activity space, there is the one and only manifolds, but there are other things. There's factorized representations, there's topography, there's linear decodability, and all of those kind of are features at the activity space that if you constrain the activity space to have any of these, you have added structure. And that could be the key to generating data structures. So really, the bottom line for going after kind of the relationship between behavior and brain in the cognitive space is that from the cognition, we look for internal models that operate on data structures. And in the brain, then we're looking for embeddings of those structures. And the inference that the cognition is about running dynamics on those data structures, right? That's basically the connection between them turns out to be like that. So really, from the perspective of cognition, the relationship between the brain and behavior perhaps can be kind of casted in the form of the relationship between data structures that a cognitive scientist would like to look at to understand the cognitive behavior, and embeddings of those structures in the brain that afford computations through dynamics. So, this is where really the algorithm comes alive, right? So we want to understand algorithms, but now we kind of have to face this really massive challenge, because if we want to try to understand the cognitive algorithms, we kind of have to solve three problems simultaneously. We have to figure out the appropriate data structure. We have to figure out how it's embedded in the neural circuits. And then we have to figure out how to intervene on it, how to actually use that data structure to move around and make inferences on the data structure that is available to us. And that's a hard problem. So what have we done? Well, we have not done quite a bit cognition in the current field. Where we are now is that we sort of come up with tasks that look cognitive in some ways. They're simple. They're oftentimes automatized. We train these animals to do this ad nauseum, so they're sort of baked in. And yes, they're somewhat flexible, and some of the efforts, more recent efforts, contextualize now decision-making, context-dependent timing, and various things that many of us and many others in the field have been looking at, is sort of moving slowly towards the idea of generating flexible behavior, which means having some internal model and then see how you work on them. By the way, how am I doing with time?
You're 7.5 in.
Great. Yeah, so that's sort of like where the current state of the field is, and in this larger goal of connecting the data structures to the structures in the brain. Okay, so what I guess from the morning we're left with is this idea that, okay, we have a weight space and we have an activity space, and largely the discussions were on activity space, although Francesca, has done some really amazing work connecting these weight space structures to activity space. But that's sort of where we are. The idea is that can we now look at the weight space and figure out where are those priors? What is the sort of the abstraction, appropriate abstraction in the weight space that would lead us to inductive biases, understanding inductive biases, and what are the structures or embeddings in the activity space that kind of is the instantiation of the internal model that then one can do inference on, right? And we've been talking about manifolds and low dimensional representations, but I want to kind of raise this point that tickles me all the time, which is that's not the only data structure that perhaps we might be thinking about. That might be one level of abstraction for certain types of behavior, and cognition might actually force us to go even further up the abstraction ladder to be able to really connect things. So in our lab, we sort of started from this toyish set of ideas. One thing that, for example, we have done is to try to understand, given the importance of the prior and inference, we tried to look at the inference in a very simple problem of, how does a brain make an inference about a interval in a task where, animals had to measure an interval and then produce an interval, right? And it turns out if that interval that you're measuring coming from some prior distribution here, P of TS, then humans and monkeys cleverly measure the interval, but then incorporate their knowledge about the prior into their measurement. And that leads to their behavior being slightly biased away from what they measure towards the mean of the prior. And this is a good thing, because what it allows you to do is that actually when you're biased, your overall error drops. And the reason for that is that it allows system to reduce its variance, right? So this is like one idea of one very, very simple form of inference. This is statistical inference. And in the domain of statistical inference within a single scalar variable time, all right? Perhaps we've taken it to the simplest possible problem that one can hope to tackle. So we have a good kind of a candidate solution to this problem, right? And the candidate solution is that what we found is that time is a scalar, but the brain seems to be solving this problem by putting this scalar on a curved or a nonlinear embedded curved trajectory, right? So when the animal learns the prior distribution, the weights are adjusted in ways that we don't understand. But the end result is that elapsed time, the passage of time, causes a neural trajectory to evolve in the state space along a curved trajectory. And then when we ask the animal to, okay, tell us what the interval was or reproduce it, the brain projects this activity onto a line. And by projecting this activity onto a line, because the sort of a natural feature of the curvature is that projections lead to warped representations, this immediately allows the system to create the sorts of biases that the animal exhibits in its behavior. And indeed, for the type of variance in timing, which is called scalar variability, meaning that the variability is aligned with elapsed time, it actually also allows to reduce the variance, as these sort of size of these error bars are saying. So, this is a very simple version. And yes, in this situation, we think we have some sense of connecting the embedded structure, which is here the prior distribution, into the system in a way that we understand how the computation or inference over this structure is being carried out. But I want to zoom out before I finish and say, really, this is, I think, where we are with cognition, which is sort of this schematic with no real answers to it. So this schematic is, we're talking about data structures, and maybe these and many others are the ones to be thinking about when we're thinking about cognitive computations. And then at this end, we have, neurons and weights and activity state spaces. And really, principal component analysis that has been the workhorse of what we have done. We might have to become really clever in trying to understand better ways of thinking about embedding of these things, these much more interesting sort of cognitive objects into these circuits. And then after we figure that out, then we can ask questions about actually algorithm, because the algorithm is sort of execution or carrying out a certain intervention on these networks, like an input, right? So, okay, if an input goes to a recurrent network, our current view is that in this low-D space, it puts you in some initial condition or places you in a particular part of the state space. That's the way we currently think about it. And we say different parts of the state space are sort of organized in different ways, and therefore this input allows you to control something. Well, in different types of data structures, that input might be doing different things, right? So it could be that in this case, really a better understanding of what an input does in a causal network is that it gives you information about one of the nodes, and then you require message passing in that system to be able to figure out what actually are the posterior probabilities over the other nodes. And if we need to really connect, if we want to really connect this to what's happening in the brain, we have to solve the problem of how do we figure out the embedding of this, structure in this network, and how do we figure out how the input that is, acting on this network actually in this more abstract space, what it's doing is that it's choosing a node, right? And that sort of that connection is the exciting connection that I think in years ahead we want to really tackle as a field for bringing computation through dynamics to the space of cognition. So with that, I want to thank again the organizers for inviting me to give me this opportunity to think about this stuff a little bit more and share them. Thank the funding agencies and especially Simons that is a major support of the thinking that goes in our lab. And much of what I say comes from interactions with really brilliant people in the lab whose names are here, current and past. And I also wish to thank them because they really enrich the thought process in the lab. And with that, I finish. And if there are questions or however the organization is, will follow.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mehrdad. That was great. And Amazing to pack that all into 15 minutes. We'll go ahead and hold questions until maybe for the larger discussion, but for sure, please, folks, if you want to queue up questions for, Mehrdad's topics, please do, and our volunteers will be kind of sifting those out. So now we're going to go ahead and jump to the sort of perspectives portion where we're going to do this kind of hit and run between all these amazing people. And you'll notice that I'm skipping introductions, and I apologize, but they're so well credentialed that the introductions would be about as long as their perspectives themselves. So I have the pleasure of bringing up now Krishna Shenoy, who is one of my postdoctoral mentors and still a lifelong mentor. Krishna, I'm gonna try to keep you to 4 minutes here. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me and see my slides?
We see your slide.
Okay, so I was asked to just provide a few sort of high-level thoughts to help us transition into the more open Q&A session. And one question that comes up is, how did we get here? And just reminding ourselves of some of the things that we've heard this morning already is that we're really seeking to understand how neural activity produces behavior. And we're doing this by investigating neural population activity as it relates to computations first, and then on to behavior. And to do so, this approach often takes the form of a dynamical systems framework, be it linear or increasingly nonlinear. And I'd just like to point out that, of course, as with every field of science and engineering, and there's many different levels, and they're all extremely important. And I think that a satisfactory answer, in my personal opinion, really requires from molecules through behavior. And we're really coming in at one slice that is sort of right in the middle of that, okay? I think that it's also important to remind ourselves that this is a very nascent, small subfield. To not go too far out on a limb, basically, math itself has not been a mainstay of a lot of systems neuroscience, with some key exceptions, of course, Hodgkin-Huxley and so forth. But this is still quite nascent, although as we've seen from the others' talks, there's already some interesting results. And so the key for moving forward surely is to embrace a rich diversity of approaches. Now, in the near term versus the more distant term, the near term, I think the future is very bright for several reasons, including the ever-increasing capacity to measure and perturb more and more neurons as we become more on par with the large sets of neurons, okay? And also new computational approaches and, frankly, computational horsepower to handle these large data sets, okay? So this is not yet another talk saying, oh, big data, big data, big data. It's simply recognizing that finally we're getting out from being so data limited that we're in the juicier spot of being idea limited, hopefully. And that leads us to the more distant horizon, which I hope doesn't mean too many more years. In fact, we're talking today about these things, trying to connect measurement to computations and onto theory, and ultimately driving a comprehensive theory that really requires new ideas in tight connection with experimental validation. So I'm often fond of saying that we're on the trail, which is pretty meaningless, unless you think about it. If you're out hiking and you're on the trail, at least it's better than being lost in the woods. You're probably going to run into somebody if you follow the trail. But it's hard to know how much farther you have to go before you're going to get to some nice lookout or the final destination, okay? And down here, I just very much want to thank Simon's collaboration again, and Mehrdad and several other key faculty in all the lab as we go forward. So in the remaining couple of slides and couple of minutes, the new conceptual framework that we've been talking about this morning really is this dynamical systems perspective. And I'm quite fond of this quote by John Cunningham and Byron Yu from several years ago. And you can read it on your own, but I'll read it too. Population analyses are necessary in settings where there may be neural mechanisms that involve coordination of responses across neurons. These mechanisms exist only at the level of the population and not at the level of the single neuron. And here's really the key, such that if you're studying single neuron responses, it can appear hopeless, unlike what Sarab and Abby were saying. Confusing, or worse, can actually be misleading. So we're trying to measure from populations of neural responses, extract the dynamics, or often called latent dynamics, understand the relationship to computation, which is this computation through dynamics idea, all overlaid by theory, and ultimately, as we know, the proof is in the pudding of behavior. And just two last slides. The first
I apologize, we're at 5, so I'll give you 30
sure,
seconds.
yeah. That's fine. That's fine. It was meant to be haltable.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Krishna. Sorry for cutting you off there.
No, it's fine.
I'll go ahead and ask John if you can take over the screen sharing, but I'm hoping that we'll have much more time to discuss, obviously, in a few minutes. So thanks very much. John, you can go ahead and take it away. If you're talking, we can't hear you, actually.
Mute myself. Share
Okay.
screen. Share. Can you hear me now?
Great.
Okay, so I want Chetan, thanks for inviting me, Maleficent, to the ball. I hope you don't regret it. So I'm going to go fast here. So I'm going to start by sort of really, Mehrdad sort of set things up really well for me by saying, we're going to think about cognition. We need to go back to the definition, which I think is still the best, which is it's computations over representations. And to give a sort of very banal example, think of the word facetious in your head and then count how many vowel types there are in the word facetious. So you have a representation of the word in your head, and then you do an operation on it, counting the number of vowel types. Now, dynamical systems approaches, if you look in the history and philosophy of science, have often been offered up as a non-representational and non-mechanistic alternative to that view. So if you take the original papers that Krishna and Mark wrote about planning and motor cortex, they specifically, correctly, I think, bashed on the representational view of motor cortex, for example, directional tuning and things like that, and wanted to substitute it with a non-representational initialization of a dynamical system. And it's also non-mechanistic. I mean, David Cicillo has written in papers of his that we don't really take into account anatomy or connectivity or cell type or anything like that. So basically, dynamical systems approaches can be considered non-representational and non-mechanistic. So how on earth are they going to help us understand cognition? So let's say we do dimensionality reduction of some kind on prefrontal cortex neuropopulation for the facetious task. And let's say, forgive me for being so, we get a trajectory of some kind. What is it? Is it a representation or a computation? Is it something that the brain itself is using as a representation? In other words, it's an ontologically real object. Or is it a correlation for us experimenters, a sort of epistemological crutch? So for example, in Abby and Mark's work, if you look at those initial principal components in motor cortex, you can derive velocity of a movement from those principal components, but we know that they're not actually causally the relevant dimensions for the actual movement itself. So you can fool yourself into decoding something, even though it's actually causally irrelevant to the behavior. So the question is can we derive a general principle? I mean, can we actually come up with a theory that is a link, as Mehrdad was talking, between the observed dynamics and the computations causing them? Will we one day be given a trajectory from neural data and be able to explain what the operational algorithm is that's being performed, or are we doomed to just be in the classification business? So I propose that these trajectories are a kind of internal behavior or neural psychophysics, which, like real behavior, will reveal visualizable motifs, regularities, and invariances that are clues, like real behavior, to construct MAR level 1 and 2 theories of cognition, but they are not in themselves explanations. They are not in themselves computations. They are telling us something about those things, but all they really are is a potential jumping off point for them. And we have to admit that, and I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, John. So you're playing your role well. I would really appreciate that. And let's go ahead and switch over. Adrian, if you could take over. Perfect. Can't hear you yet, sorry.
I will show a couple of slides and come back to this picture that are shown in other contexts, which, you know, trying to use to summarize, actually to reiterate some of the points that John and Mehrdad and others have already made. And, you know, this is what we're trying to do, I think, in neuroscience. We're trying, you know, this is very Ma-inspired, obviously, but slightly different drawing of it. Trying to figure out what the computation is. We're faced with that computation being implemented by a very high dimensional system, the brain, which is trivially a dynamical system in that it's a piece of physics, right? It's matter that is governed by a very huge set of differential equations that govern its dynamics. And our goal in trying to understand is to come up with a much lower dimensional model that reveals for us the fundamental mechanisms of that computation. And what we've heard from our speakers in really beautiful talks is a kind of new approach to that, or a relatively recent approach, to kind of replace the brain with a much smaller dimensional dynamical system, right? A medium dimensional system, maybe not as high dimensional as the brain, and kind of redraw the problem, right? So that we're going to now understand how computation is enacted by that medium dimensional system. And then we have all the beautiful tools of physics to tell us, you know, what kind of attractor structures are embedded in that medium dimensional system, and be able to figure out how that engineered system is doing the computation. And that hopefully allows us to go back to the real brain to figure out what it is that the real brain is doing based on the intuition that we've gotten from the analysis of this much lower dimensional operation. So where does that leave us? You know, what are the gaps, and what are the questions that remain? I think one of the key things to me that comes out when I hear the descriptions of the progress, which is beautiful, is the separation between dynamics and input and context. You know, all of these things are just variables, right, in our original very, very high dimensional system. And we're kind of making somewhat arbitrary distinctions between which is which. And there is quite a bit of sort of system engineering that's involved in doing that. In a couple of cases you see, and I think this comes back to kind of John's points, is that we're kind of moving a homunculus outside the system, right? There's something that somehow knows how to set up the preparatory activity in order to drive those dynamics. And there's a huge question remaining of where that is and how we know how to do that. How do we generate non-stereotype activity? You know, somehow there is embedded here a forward model, right, of how the body works, and something has to figure out how to make use of that forward model. So Mehrdad already talked about what kinds of computations are still hard, right, within this framework, and, you know, reasoning, manipulation of internal variables. Mehrdad gave a really beautiful, you know, account of you know, why that's hard and why we still don't know how to do it. And I guess ultimately, in coming back to the real brain, the brain, you know, initiative is giving us huge amounts of information about the real brain, and we would really like one day to understand, you know what's going on there. So what's missing here? So all the microscopic influences, right? Spatial properties, these are all ordinary differential equations, not partial differential equations. Space matters, things diffuse. Neuromodulators shift single neuron properties and synaptic properties over multiple timescales. We have cell types, we have physical properties of signal flow. And all of those things are not intrinsically necessarily built into this framework. And so you guys have been incredibly creative in finding ways to assign them to context or input. But ultimately, we would love to really be able to tie them back to the underlying real biology, so that we can, you know, fulfill our role and intervene, right, as biologists in mental health and other areas. So that's where I'll leave it.
That's really wonderful. Thank you, Adrian. These are really thought-provoking little vignettes here. Now I'll turn it over to the other wonderful Abby on the panel, Abby Person. We can't hear you right now. Sorry, Abby, I think you're muted. There we go.
Thanks. Well, so as a member of the Simons-Emory Motor Consortium, I've had this opportunity to talk with Chetan quite a bit about dynamical systems and state space trajectories. And so I appreciate him being brave enough to bring me on as a real outsider to this crew to share my perspective on these kinds of analyses. So I share a view of many neuroscientists that brains are tractable physical systems and that we can understand some principles of operation through hypothesis-driven research, and that already we have beautiful examples of how neural tissue is organized to implement a variety of complex computations. And these have explanatory power at the psychophysical and behavioral levels. As has been pointed out before, the Jeffers sound localization model, which has a biological replica in the avian auditory brainstem, is a very cool example of how a circuit can implement a computation. Gorgeous work in the fly has illustrated that the ellipsoid body implements a ring attractor for orientation in space. In my neck of the woods, architecture-driven theory has proposed with a lot of support that cerebellar architecture supports a perceptron-like computation. And so these are the kinds of, I think, examples in neuroscience that really fascinate me and I think are the most beautiful kinds of neuroscience out there. Of course, when we think about computations, we can think of them as a series of algorithmic steps, like first multiply the terms, then apply a low-pass filter, normalize the data, and voila, you'll have some new insight. That's data processing that we're familiar with. And evidently from the readout of behavior, brains must do this, and neuroscientists have identified canonical circuit motifs that perform some of these basic mathematical operations. Such as those described in this lovely review by Braganza and Beck. So these circuit motifs are seen throughout the brain, and when stitched together could give rise to more complex computations, hypothesized to underlie a variety of phenomena. I think Mehrdad was alluding to these, Francesca was alluding to these kinds of embedded sort of subroutines. And these are the circuit motifs that do this. And someone could go ahead and put together a state space description of each one of these circuit motifs. And I haven't done that, but I'll return to that point momentarily. Now, when we get into cortex, we kind of lose a through line in architecture-driven computation because of the immense recurrence of cortical circuitry. And of course, artificial neural networks have provided some insight, but I think as biologists, we're really longing for something more. The adoption of these state space descriptions for these kinds of circuits seems promising, but they're often kind of puzzling because we'd really like to map back some of these low dimensional descriptions onto sayable steps along the path of a computation, and ideally describe the microcircuits that produce those computations. So is there any promise to that hope? So I think, as we saw in Abby Russo's lovely work comparing the supplementary motor area and M1, there's clearly differentiation of state space trajectories recorded in diverse regions of cortex, as shown here between SMA and M1. Now, this isn't exactly surprising because these represent different firing patterns, but it is super encouraging that these low dimensional representations maintain differential structure, reflecting the old view of tuning, but providing new insight into these more fascinating computations. But I think these observations also make me wonder, what is the appropriate granularity for neural populations in order for us to identify computations through dynamics? Are these groupings too big? If they were smaller, would they, reveal new kinds of computations or subroutines? Are they too small? So are we, not sampling enough of the brain? And how do these state space trajectories look when we start adding more and more and more data, or less and less and less data? And I guess my underlying question for the panel is whether we can grapple with these microcircuits all the way to the macro circuits to define what X really is. What's our population? Do we have one population because all the neurons are interconnected, or do we have, billions of populations? And are there different answers to those questions? And I think that there probably are. So ultimately, I would love it if there were better stepping stones that map these trajectories onto something more tangible like circuits, even if these mappings lack, real explanatory power. And I think that that kind of mapping is going to give a kind of power to these analyses that will really open the door for a variety of therapeutic applications and probably opportunity to understand the etiology of neurological disease. So thanks for my 4+ minutes.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And I hope, everyone watching can appreciate that we have such a wide variety of perspectives here. These are all very important and fascinating questions. So I think we'll start the discussion period. I'm just going to give the panelists an opportunity if there was anything they heard during everyone else's period, if there's something that folks want to respond to, because if not, I'm going to start, needling in with some harder questions. So did anybody hear something that they'd like to go ahead and take on?
Well, I think this probably will be kind of a meaty topic of discussion. So I'll open it now. But I think the question of representation that John brought up, and how representation frameworks and dynamical frameworks play together is an interesting and complicated one. And I can speak to my own work. And so I think basically the considering starting with motor cortex, for example, clearly there are muscle-like signals in motor cortex, and that would be predicted by both the representational framework and by our framework. I think the difference in that case, to my mind, is really just kind of a semantic one. When you say, muscle activity is represented in motor cortex, or the computation of motor cortex is to represent muscle activity, that to me says something very different, just because it, in my mind, kind of implies the end of the line, that some other brain region will do something with that. But if you say the goal of motor cortex is to generate muscle activity, that to me is, I would argue, closer to the truth in the case of motor cortex. I think the question becomes a little bit more complicated and interesting with respect to my SMA story about divergence. And I think, this is something that is, will be open to just empirical research, but you could look at my data and say that, well, maybe there's a time variable that's represented in SMA, or maybe there's a representation of the target, or a representation of how many cycles have passed, and so on. And that to me is less of a satisfying explanation for a couple of reasons. One of which is that the structure that we catalog in SMA, there's this translation in state space. There's these other features too, though, this kind of going into other subspaces as the movement unfolds. There's a bunch of different motifs that don't seem to be easily explained by a representational explanation, but from the perspective of low divergence, all these different features seem to point in the same direction. And I think the real question is, which ideas generalize? Is target represented in SMA in all sorts of other tasks? Or, is this property of divergence, true in other tasks and maybe manifests in a different way? Maybe not through representing the target or not through representing time, but through representing something else that's relevant to guiding movement over long time scales.
Nathan, can I say something to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, but I totally agree that the dynamical systems approach when it comes to motor cortex can be eliminationist. In other words, you don't have to come up with the notion of representation, just like you don't have to come up with a representation in a CPG in the spinal cord saying it represents a leg would be absurd, right? But there comes a point where representation is an extremely powerful and necessary concept in cognition, where it has intentionality, it has detachment. It's something that functions instead of a stimulus as a representation. Even when your SMA work, it represents where you are in the sequence. So what happens is you go from an eliminationist point of view about dynamics in the sensory motor system to an implementationist view of dynamics. But nevertheless, somehow representation is having to be implemented. So the confusion that everyone, I think, has is they go from an eliminationist view to an implementationist view and don't realize they've made the transition.
I'll let that settle for a second. To be honest, I might not kind of get the potential conundrum here. Is anyone arguing that dynamical systems would not be able to represent a variable, or like hold on to a representation of something?
You just need to know the history. If you go to Van Gelder and others, Turvey, Kelso, these originally brought into the field to go against the representational computational view. And that's still very much true in the enactivist tradition and in others. So in other words, those who know no history are doomed to repeat it. And we just basically have to be aware of what we're saying. And I don't think people are denying that there can be a representational capacity to dynamical systems. It's just that originally, when they first came along with Krishna and Mark, they literally were against the representational view of motor cortex, as from Georgopoulos, for example, quite rightly. It's just that won't work for cognition, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I feel like representation and dynamics are kind of the same thing in the motor cortex. So you don't really need to work too hard, right, to fight that battle. Whereas I think my dad really beautifully laid out the issues in taking it into the cognitive domain. What is the data structure? Where is a representation that we can now run a dynamics on to manipulate it to run a thought, right? When we're not constrained, you don't think at a certain time frame, right? Whereas you have to generate a movement that rolls out over time. And so our dynamical system will capture that temporal dynamics. And I think Mehrdad's, been very insightful in using time, right, as his first cognitive task, because that does really lend itself to a dynamical systems point of view. But how do we then move away from that into, computations that we get done at light speed? We're all watching, I know we are, Queen's Gambit, right? You can think at very different timescales.
So I just agree totally that, the origins of staring at single neurons that, speaking very technically, have wiggles and squiggles all over the place. This is the heterogeneity and complexity. Makes it very hard to come up with more than, literally figure one, where a neuron does something so perfect that you can say, oh, that's what it represents. So in the motor system, a bunch of neurons get together, create a movement. Some of them are going to look representational, some aren't. I don't think that's particularly interesting in the motor system. The more interesting thing, not that that's not interesting, but it can be semantic. The more interesting thing, I think, is as we enter more cognitive domains, like John and Mehrdad or Adrian, you're saying. And so, a recent example that Bill Newsom and I have been working on is now that it's possible to track decision variables in real time and intervene with them causally, you have a quantity that you can hold on to that is a scalar that you can call a decision variable. And so we could again ask the question, is that neural state representing the log likelihood of a decision to the left or to the right? Or is it merely, it's sort of an accumulator on a drift diffusion model or a diffusion to bound model and so forth? So again, maybe that's semantic, maybe it's not. So I just think that staying very grounded in what we can actually measure and not imposing semantic labels may be fruitful.
I guess ultimately, I think Abby's point was that the imposing of those semantic labels is what we mean by identifying computation, right? That is the extraction of the algorithm from the dynamics. So ultimately, we do want to do that.
Well, I thoroughly agree. Ultimately, I just don't know if that's, 20 years from now, or until we know the whole system, it's sort of hard to, I often fall back on electrical engineering examples that are often not helpful. But I think this one might be, you give me 1,000 oscilloscope probes and I can poke around the CPU or GPU or whatever you want to talk about these days, right? And I can learn a lot, of course, and a lot of people have made elaborate examples about this, but it's going to be very hard until you really understand how everything works to know what is appropriate to say, oh, well, that's a memory element that contains a variable. Oh, that's an intermediate transient variable that's just a running accumulator. So it's, I don't know, I'm sort of half humbled, half scared by the the abilities of the brain and the mysteries.
What I would say, Krishna, also is the whole point of cognition is it is semantic. We have to get the semantics. That's the problem. But the difference between the sensory motor system and the cognitive system is, one, we have to solve the semantic puzzle, the other we don't.
Maybe.
I disagree with that for the sensory system. Sensation is applying semantics, right. And there's a continual interplay between semantic interpretation and incoming information.
Glad you brought that up. I think that's exactly correct. I mean, where does a representation of a cat first occur? It's both at the retina and it's at IT and everywhere in between. And what does it all mean? I'd rather, see if we can work out the circuits.
Well, I guess I'll just say something that maybe echoes what John was saying, which is, even for the motor system, we can make the same argument that, interesting aspects of the motor system also require semantics. I think the question is that, the interesting parts require semantics. Like the parts that actually now become elements that you can now, use to construct more interesting aspects. When you get to motor system planning is really not that straightforward. It's not like anymore like a, input-output sensory motor system. You can plan, you can decide not to do that plan, you can, counterfactually plan. So immediately then you have those semantics again coming in. So I think anything that kind of lends itself to flexible manipulation requires some form of semantics attached to it.
All right. Give me 1 second. I'm going to turn to a hard question, I think, from the audience here. So I think, Krishna, at some point during your period, you referred to sort of a comprehensive theory of brain dynamics. And somebody was, Ilya Nemenman here at Emory was wondering, what might that look like? What is a comprehensive theory of brain dynamics?
Oh, yeah. Great question. I have no idea. But it should answer questions, I think, at all the different multiple levels and, jive with all knowledge. It's sort of like a grand unification theory. I was meaning in a very loose sense. That's quite off in the future. I think that for the coming many years, it'll be great if we could just move beyond one system to even get two systems interacting and understood. Sort of multi-area would be wonderful. So I'm not trying to dodge the question. I'm just saying I don't know, other than that in principle ought to be the goal.
Krishna, can I ask a question about your assumption about different areas here? So what in a brain where everything is interconnected, I get Francesca's point that they have different afferents, but that's a continuous difference across brain areas, not a categorical difference typically. So why is a piece of the circuit in the system and a piece of the circuit not in the system? And are there principles that people should be using to define those boundaries?
Well, I know there's people on the call and certainly on YouTube that are far more expert than I am, but I would totally agree that it is surprising on the one hand how similar to anatomically defined different areas often look. They can look rather similar. Yet we know that there are, broad segregations, of course, just like your wonderful talk. So I think that that's really a very timely and tractable question that many in the field are working on now. An RNN that is a, quote, bag of neurons. You just treat the whole brain as non-differentiated, or multiple stages where you have some information or latency bottleneck between them and so forth. Jonathan Michaels has a PNAS piece that just came out that's, I think, a wonderful example of that. How do you even get to three levels, three modules? How can you understand that relationship? The tough part will then be, I think, going back and proving it experimentally. Once the tough part of having the ideas and the model set up, it's all tough.
Anyone else want to speak to that? I think it's a really fascinating topic of whether, these notions of computation through dynamics, do we need to rethink how we've traditionally talked about boundaries between areas? Are there just multiple levels that we need to be thinking about?
I actually think this question of brain regions is a really good one. I mean, I think certainly it's becoming more appreciated that certain things like motor variables or thirst and so on are, to use John's word, represented everywhere in the brain, even in areas that you might not traditionally think are responsible for those things. So then what does a notion of a brain region even mean? On one hand, you could be extreme and say, well, yeah, that's exactly what we were doing with RNNs. You have, as Krishna said, a ball of neurons, and you're just generally looking for the kinds of computations that this ball of neurons does. But I think, we don't necessarily have the tools to do this super well currently, but I think this is where having models will help us, right? If you have a behavior that is sufficiently complex, as Mehrdad put it, like planning or any of the cognitive things, or even feedback control, it isn't one brain region or one small group of neurons in layer 5 motor cortex that ultimately are responsible. So how does one, just by looking at behavior, come up with some sort of hypothesis for the differences that you'll see and how that labor is divided across the brain? Because it isn't the case that one region will just do everything and the rest just filter it through. So I think we do need to build these models. I actually read this beautiful review by Matt Perrick and Kanakarajan yesterday on network of networks. And I think these kinds of ideas, coupled with Jonathan's PNAS paper, I think are now more important than ever, But I think at the same time, there has to be this push in technology where we can actually record a reasonable number of neurons from multiple brain regions, right? If we were living in an era where you're recording one at a time, it's very, very challenging to record any reasonably sized population. Tools like LFAS that Chetan and David Cecil and others have worked on have given us the ability to do single trial analyses. So I think I go back to Krishna's point about this being a nascent field, and that I think only now has there been this confluence of ideas, theory, techniques, and tools that we can begin to go after these. But I for one, Abby, fully agree that your point about brain regions is sort of one of the next big challenges that we absolutely need to go after. This model of one lab, one region, one task is no longer tenable.
Might be a little unrealistic to think that brain regions will sort of emerge as a principle from modeling, given that we've built them over evolution and we've added capability over time. So I think that is a case where a little bit of judicious top-down engineering is going to be needed to explain that.
I mean totally. Sorry, go ahead, John.
No, go.
I was just saying, I mean, for certain brain regions that, as Abby Russo put it, if motor cortex ultimately does need to generate something like EMG, it makes sense to think of different regions. And really, I think the question is, what inputs need to go to premotor cortex or motor cortex? And, given the right inputs, motor cortex can use its local dynamics, which we still don't have a good handle on really estimating, but there might be some ideas. But given the right inputs, it can use whatever lives there in that region to do the right job. But what are the inputs? Where do they come from? I totally agree.
I was just going to say two things. One is, if there's one thing we know about evolution, and I'm not talking about evolution, the vanilla one, I'm talking about all the work that's been done on the evolution of complexity, which is itself a little bit of a mystery. Why aren't we all still worms from 500 million years ago? But one of the things that the evolution of complexity has shown us that you divide and conquer. You basically develop parts and you compartmentalize. Okay, so it's highly modular. You look at prokaryotes and then you look at eukaryotes and you have mitochondria, which were swallowed prokaryotes, and you basically compartmentalize and specialize. That is a universal feature of the evolution of complexity. So very similarly, I'm happy to have anyone round on the stroke ward with me to see just how modular the effects of lesions are. You can lesion all over the cortex. I can assure you the patients still feel very thirsty, right? So I think, Sherrington over a century ago found responses in the both hemispheres to movement of a limb, and then basically savagely removed that whole hemisphere with no consequence whatsoever on movement of the limb. So we're going to have come up with a much more sensible theory about having correlations with variables surprisingly all over the place versus whether they're of any causal consequence whatsoever.
I second the notion that we definitely need to do a lot more causal interventions.
Sure, and I think that actually segues us really well to a question from Kyle Poe from the YouTube comments. He asked, what are some potential avenues to demonstrating causality between population dynamics in the language of CTD?
I mean, I think Abby talked about this literally on the first or second one of her slides, and that we currently don't have the ability to arbitrarily move the state around, right? Ultimately, that is what would be required. But, I think there's some encouraging evidence in the mouse, visual cortex in particular. I think there were like 3 papers that came out in the last few years where they have had some success in using those kinds of ideas. But I think, yeah, ultimately, if we believe, for example, rotations are intimately tied to behavior in some way, I think the way to do it is actually be able to manipulate them. But I don't think that's a limitation of computation through dynamics in any way. I think that's just, again, as I said it previously, the tools are becoming more available. Oh, I guess Kyle is here. Maybe, hey, Kyle. Maybe he's not here.
Hi.
Hey, how's it
I
going?
just figured I'm saying I'm good. How are you?
Good, good.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, again, I was just, thinking about, given what we were, or what you were all discussing regarding, what it would mean for something, for a representation to, be any more true or causal in some sense than any other. How might we approach, tackling that problem within this framework?
So I can speak a little to this too. So I think the ultimate test of some of these ideas, my ideas in particular, would be if you had the ability to, make a network in vivo in real time, more or less tangled, and watch the fallout from that. And as Saurabh says, there's potentially some ability to do that in the future, but it is a mighty challenge, which is brings us to your question. So I think in lieu of that ability, there's a couple things we can do from this computation through dynamics framework to give us a little more confidence in these ideas while we wait on the technology to do that. One of which is to rely on artificial networks, as Saurabh was pointing out, networks where you do have that ability to at will, change the features that you think that you're hypothesizing really matter. And I also think that leveraging natural variability and natural failure, and watching how the brain fails, and if it fails in ways you would predict from these computation through dynamics frameworks, and rich behavioral tasks too, where you would challenge, say in my tasks with the SMA story, for example, the hypothesis is that SMA guides movement over long time scales, but surely there's, some limit to how long it can do that. Can the animal, count to 30 cycles in its head? Probably not. Humans can, but animals can't. And so, are those natural limits? Do they fit into the framework in the way that you would expect? So.
Abby, can I ask a question about that, particularly with respect to tangling? Because the difference between M1 and SMA, in principle, right? So you've got something that does that versus something that does that is one dimension. And so that does seem like an easy manipulation in principle, right? If you can identify that one dimension that lifts it out of the plane, maybe it's a single neuron, but maybe it's a group of neurons, but you could in principle drive those. Do you think that's within reach using the kinds of techniques that people are working on?
I think potentially. I think that, well, I think this kind of, I guess, brings us back to Abby Person's kind of question about the multiple regions. But I think that the brain, I think it would be reasonable for the brain to segregate those computations. I think that actually may be a useful feature for the brain to have a set of structure that looks like M1 and a set of structure that looks like SMA. Particularly because, I think it's useful, it could be useful for a number of reasons, one of which is that, motor cortex, it's not just doing the circle thing, it still has to generate patterns of muscle activity. We're not seeing that in the dominant dimensions, but, if you did also stretch it out, you might run into these issues of dynamic range, where if you're devoting a ton of your variance, in SMA, a ton of the variance is devoted to this low divergence feature. And so you may not have the dynamic range to also generate muscle activity, but also I think it would enable the brain to learn to make changes to the dynamics, both in a way, if it made those changes in M1, those changes would generalize to other cycles, whereas if it made changes to the dynamics in SMA, it could make changes to specific cycles. So I don't know. I think it's a really interesting question, but yeah, we'll see.
What do you think about the prospects for putting a BCI in the loop that might be able to figure out how to find those dimensions and drive them?
I think yeah. Go ahead, Krishna.
No, go ahead, Abby. Yeah.
I think it would be fascinating and really exciting, but I do think it is a mighty challenge, but really super exciting too. Yeah.
I was just gonna quickly sneak in that short of doing spatial temporally patterned activation as is being done on the mouse, which will ultimately be possible in higher, in monkeys. Several people are doing electrical stimulation, Dan O'Shea in our lab, optogenetic perturbation, Dan, Leah, and Manish doing that. So you can take the neural state and move it, but you can't control which direction. But you can do basically pulse probe, pump probe experiments type thing, pharmacological manipulations. Can that alter rotation speeds? Lesion work, mucimol. So there's a whole bunch of causal perturbations one can do to get at it, just short of exactly the dream experiment. Yeah.
Can I say something also? I guess some people know that I'm not, I always caution people about causal manipulation. So maybe, maybe I should say a word about that, since now everyone's saying causal manipulation is good. Maybe somebody should say it's not so good. And I actually do think there are serious issues with causal manipulation. So I guess at a high level, causal manipulations are just experiments. They're great. Why not do them? Any version of it you can do is one extra data point, and that's very valuable. I'm not going to be sitting here saying collecting data is a bad idea. But here's the problem. Causal manipulation, in the situations where we have a model of the system, where arbitrary causal manipulations actually are associated with some prediction, yes, great. Go ahead, do whatever causal manipulation in whatever direction you want to do, because you actually do have a model that makes certain predictions. Even if your causal manipulation is not relevant for the specific hypothesis you're testing, if you still have a model, maybe your model tells you that if you do this causal manipulation, the monkey will abort, will just not do the trial. Then you can go and test it, and that's a great thing to test. That's one more validation of your model. But when you don't have a model and you do a causal manipulation, then the problem is that there are all sorts of epiphenomena that can creep in. Both positive and negative results are problematic to make interpretations for. Sometimes you don't get an effect and you make inferences that are not necessarily right, because you didn't really understand the way the system, the embedding of the information in that system was not available to you, and your perturbation was not appropriate for actually navigating in that internal model in the way that you would hope to see some really meaningful effect on behavior. Positive effects are also problematic, because if you don't understand the algorithm that the system is sort of operating on, then you might see an effect. And to some extent, even that effect might be specific, but unless you really have very good combination of experiments that shows that that effect kind of stands a real test across conditions, then I think these sort of efforts to do random perturbations only are great if you really do have a model. So I want to say, as much as I love perturbations, I would say, much of the field, not everyone, not all studies, but much of the field do great work correlationally, build models, characterize all the sort of the knobs of the model in relation to behavior, and then do causal manipulation and say this area is involved or is not involved. And I'm not entirely sure that experiment added so much to the great work that was sort of foundational in connecting the activity to an internal model to behavior. So in that sense, I think theory and building models and understanding algorithms to some extent should be in parallel with developing causal tools, and not sort of thought as an afterthought.
All right, maybe we can pause for a second and let Nico in for a question.
Well, thanks for letting me in. Can you all hear me? Okay. I guess I just had a very simple question to the panel. First of all, thanks for everything you said. It's really enriching to listen to a variety of speakers. My question is about learning. So I guess I'm wondering about what the CTD, or the computational through dynamics framework, has to say about learning. And what I mean by that is that if we think that computation is dynamics, then how do we think about changes in computation as the individual is learning? Is the answer going to be in the dynamics, or is there going to be sort of a meta level to think about it? Thanks.
It's a great question. I can talk about it, at least in the context of the work that I've done with Krishna. Now, learning, I think, is very complicated to study, especially because behavior is changing all the time. There's also learning that happens at the level of sort of a single session, or motor adaptation in particular, which is what I've studied, and then learning that happens across sessions. I think your question is a great one, and we don't, in short, I think the answer to most of these great questions is I don't know, but at least at the level of learning or adaptation that happens within minutes to hours, it seems that the system does the simplest thing first. For example, if changing the initial condition or changing an input to the system solves the problem, i.e. achieves the appropriate behavior, then it seems that the system does that, at least in motor adaptation. But of course, I think what you're getting at is for more complicated things, even in motor control, if you need to learn some new skill that takes days, weeks, months, years, of course, at the end of the day, if it requires you generating activity that you did not know how to generate before, you will have to change something. And that could be changing the dynamics themselves. Of course, that's something we haven't studied yet, and it's really hard to do. But what I can tell you is for contexts where changing the initial condition or changing inputs can solve the problem, again, make the behavior better, that does happen. Of course, there's brain-machine interface kinds of studies as well that I'm sure you're familiar with out of Pittsburgh and so on. And there they do see that there's certain strategies that involve what is the simplest way to achieve the goal right now. And it seems that that's what the monkey does initially. But for things that are more complicated, I think there's this nomenclature of within manifold and out of manifold and so on. You can indeed learn out of the manifold. It just takes much longer. And that's where we don't know. Are you reconfiguring the circuit in some way? Are the dynamics themselves changing? But again, I feel like I'm the cheerleader here of this general framework, but I think these are exciting questions that I know we're definitely going after. Are you concerned that CTD in some ways cannot answer these questions for us, or cannot help us answer these questions?
I don't know if concern is really the right term. I think we're doing the best we can, but I guess the problem I see in the near future is that we may need some sort of semantics, not only to talk about computation, but also to talk about changes in computation. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can really achieve this kind of higher level framework, that might help guide future experiments. That's a hard goal. Yeah.
Totally. I think your work with Mehrdad regarding this curved manifold business is really beautiful. And I think that's where, both Mehrdad's comments about causal perturbations, I think, are relevant, and your comments about learning. On one hand, if you have a concrete model in mind, if you believe that curvature induces regression towards mean of the prior, which is at least how I understand it, doing a causal perturbation where if you could truly curve the manifold and see that, I do think that adds more evidence in some ways. And I think learning is perhaps one way in which you can induce that curvature. And I think you've already shown that these techniques are quite helpful in studying these kinds of computations.
I mean, I would just say to your question, that there's a difference between seeing the performance change as proof that learning is happening, the performance confound, right, which is all I think any of this has shown when it comes to learning, versus wanting some compressible learning algorithm that you'd like to be able to express, right? Just like you can talk about reinforcement learning and error-based learning, it would be nice to be able to come up with some description of what the learning algorithm is. And as far as I can tell, we've not been told anything about learning algorithms by looking at dynamical systems. We see them play out, and the on-manifold, off-manifold story I find only half convincing, which we can talk about another time. But I think your question is a very good one. We're not that good, actually, at discovering learning algorithms in biological systems beyond a few overworked examples like adaptation and some types of reinforcement learning, right? Skill learning is really difficult, right? We do better just having a neural network and training it up, right? It's actually, I agree with you that it's a bit of a puzzle.
Maybe I say one thing about learning, if I was waiting if anybody wants to chime in. So I think it's a big problem, and sort of calling learning and leave it like that is problematic. So it's really, learning is associated with changes in behavior at some level, as John was saying. But underneath it, when we want to connect it to computation through dynamics or anything you like in the brain, so long as you believe something in the brain has changed, is bundling all of that something has happened in the brain, I think is not very useful. At the very least, something that Nico knows I think hard about is that I'm not even sure all learning is synaptic. In fact, I am fairly sure all learning is not synaptic. Okay, so all the learning that we're going through talking to one another, I'm not sure continuously our synapses are storing information that we're telling each other. So this notion that learning is a really complicated one. There are learnings that are happening because you have the right algorithms and you have the right state space, and in a meta level, you can, in this form of a meta learning, you can sort of navigate the state space. And I actually think computation through dynamics could be really valuable for that in its current form. Even in its current form, just thinking about what is, for example, the error dimension, and how error learning, like in that given dimension, if on a given trial you go further out or further or less, how is it on the next trial? It's an integration of information across trial that happens, and now you go to a different part of the state space. That actually can be formalized quite well within the computation through dynamics and within activity space without much change to the current framework as we have it. But now, if you want to go steps further and say, okay, now, after you figure that out and you figured out that you have a prism on your eye and the error is consistent, now you want to maybe go one step further and embed that information into synapses, because you don't want to continuously be dealing every trial with an error, right? So then the problem gets much more challenging. Then you go into the synapses, and then the question is, this is to Abby's question about areas. Nobody, no homunculus told the brain which part of the brain is supposed to learn, right? The entire brain is going at it. Some parts happen to learn it faster, and those will take over. As soon as one part of the brain manages to remove the error, then you're done. Your learning is completed. So this question of learning, when it gets to actually solving the credit assignment problem, not the classic version that is in machine learning, even what part of the brain should be learning the task, is not at all clear. So I think that the problem of learning is not about computation through dynamics. It's just how do you find an algorithm and in a brain area and sort of a learning strategy for tackling something that you can't do. So if we know some solution to that, I think computation through dynamics will perfectly fine adapt itself to that knowledge. That's what's missing, really.
Thanks very much, Mehrdad. I'm trying to remain an unbiased moderator, but I was couldn't help but nod for much of what you were just saying. Let's go ahead and bring in another familiar face, Flip. If you could unmute yourself and join us.
Hi, thanks a lot. This has been really fun. So thank you all for putting this on, and it's been beautifully run. The whole computation through dynamics framework is really built on two separate parts. There's the projection to a low-dimensional manifold, and then there's the dynamics. And in my view, at least, the dynamics component of it in some ways is actually the less controversial. I mean, I understand John's point about that you have to be careful when thinking about dynamics, and that it doesn't exclude representation and so on. I know there are lots of issues, but in some sense, we know computation happens. It's something that happens over time. The fact that dynamics play a role maybe isn't as controversial. It's really just the difference between RNN and a static network, and there's no reason to think we don't have RNNs in the brain. The part that seems more controversial to me actually is the low-dimensional manifold component. And indeed, I think the conclusions we draw about dynamics depend a lot on the way in which we do the low-dimensional projection and the fact that we do it at all. And so the question is simply, to what extent are the conclusions that we reach about dynamics misleading because of the dependency on the fact that we're projecting or the way in which we project. And I'll just give 3 quick examples. There's, one of the early things that Krishna's lab looked at was whether there was evidence for a break or a hold signal in motor cortex, and they found that there wasn't. And so they have this argument now about shifting in state space. But of course, that hold signal could be something fairly small in terms of the overall power or variance of the signal. It could be something like a subtle IE shift that would get lost just because it doesn't have enough power. It would get lost in the projection scheme. A second example is the issue of tangling momentum that came up earlier. That really is just about what your low dimensional projection is. And then a third was something that Yarden Cohn said earlier in the notes that I thought was really good, which was something like, well, I'm quoting from him, does rotatory refer to something substantial, or is it simply saying that dynamics is bounded, and then I add in a low dimensional space? So that's it. Those are my questions.
Thanks very much, Flip. I'm gonna leave it open to see who's interested in tackling that.
I would agree in a very trivial way, even from the sensory system, right? Because we've spent years characterizing receptive fields, and then we have adaptation that changes them. We've just maybe undershot on the dimensionality of our original representation, right? So that I agree with you that in general, I think one can get a richer description by going to a high dimensional space that might, some of the ways that you guys have, super cleverly sort of parsed how computation is changing under different, contexts, for example. Maybe that's just a reflection of maybe an inappropriate or a convenient, right? It's all about convenience of our model. Projection of an extremely high dimensional problem into some particular choice of low dimensional structure. We've played a lot with that in sensory systems. I think you're just starting to play with it in terms of the dynamical spaces of the motor system.
Can I add on sort of I think it's a shared concern with Flip, or maybe a suggestion and in the way of question, which is that, if we could play with some very small toy circuits to develop some intuitions about, okay, these are the characteristics of circuits that show rotational dynamics, and then we can know that, oh, when we see rotational dynamics, it means this. The example that's always given is the pendulum, and I always think about, sort of push-pull neural circuits. And I think, is this just a trivial representation that we have excitatory and inhibitory neurons together in the brain, and they do this? And I don't think it is, but I think these are the stepping stones that would be extraordinarily valuable to the sort of broader neuroscience community to know, like, okay, here's the map, here's the intuition that you can draw from this state space trajectory.
So I'll also say that, first of all, I do totally agree. I think low variance signals can and are, can still be extremely important to the brain. And I'll point out that in my data, the motor cortex data, all the signals I showed you today, those signals aren't the muscle generating signals. The signals that generate the muscle activity are much lower variance. They're, in my data, we're about 2 to 3% of the variance. And, at the end of the day, we think that is kind of the main point of all of this stuff, is to generate patterns of muscle activity. So yeah, low variance signals are certainly very important. And that's part of why when I was giving my talk, I mentioned it briefly, but it is important to me that the metrics we designed were, generic, and, you don't need to apply dimensionality reduction in order to use those metrics. And in fact, in our paper, we applied those metrics on the full data set without any dimensionality reduction and get the same result. And, we tried matching for the number of neurons, neurons and muscles, matching for the number of dimensions, matching for the variance captured. And, that was a clear, consistent result that we always saw. And that's why I think, like, the comparative science is really helpful. So, comparing motor cortex and somatosensory cortex, which really should be an apples to apples comparison. And, we see the difference in tangling there, because you're totally right. Tangling does matter, the dimensionality there. If you project, for example, the muscle activity are contained in motor cortex. So, some projection of the data is highly tangled, precisely because it's generating muscle activity. So, yeah, I totally agree.
Flip, can I ask for a clarification of the question? Are you concerned with principal component analysis, or are you concerned with the conceptual framework that if you want to do something difficult, rich with sparse data, you need low dimensions?
Neither of the, but what I'm concerned with is that when we think about dynamics, and we're looking at, and we're building up models of dynamics, and we're doing that in a low dimensional space because otherwise the parameterization is too big and we can't do it, that we're misleading ourselves because we're working in a low dimensional space. And this is kind of a vague concern. Like, I gave 3 examples, but I know it's pretty easy to poke holes in all 3 of those examples probably. It's more just, I'm really just posing this maybe as a more general question for this panel, which is, do you worry at night when you say that you've learned something about dynamics and you write a paper that maybe those conclusions were dependent on this first pass of the analysis? That's really all I'm asking.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You know, the point I was making about understanding the right embedding is exactly aligned along this line, right? So the notion of how one should reduce the dimensionality of the problem is a really challenging problem. Is a really challenging question.
But it's not just how, it's should you. Is it the right thing to do?
Yeah,
I mean, we do it because if we don't, we can't fit dynamics. But that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do.
I think it's not about fitting the dynamics. It's about at least from the perspective that I was brought into this panel to think about cognition. I think yes. I think there is no other solution. I think that it really the capacity of a little child to learn so much from so little is only really only dependent on the fact that the search space is low dimensional, somehow made low dimensional. You can be nativist, you can be connectionist, whatever you like to, however you like to embed that low dimensionality into the system, that's your choice. And how we should recover it, I think is a really big question mark out there. But the notion that with billions of neurons and very few data points, you can so quickly make so many interesting inferences has to come from the fact that something constrains the problem.
So I'd just add that, I mean, Flip knows this for me, but we have a preoccupation with the same question, and therefore, whenever possible, always try to relate the full high dimensional raw measurements to behavior, sort of our sleep well at night sanity check. But just to add a different angle to this conversation, we have typically never tried to state a particular dimension, 9. Instead, some range. Over some range of dimensions, the results would hold up. But a few years ago, we got concerned about not having a better theoretical understanding of whether our measurements themselves were limiting the number of dimensions we saw. And so this is a piece of work that we did with Surya to understand if the number of neurons, the number of conditions or complexity of them, and the amount of time you measure, which turn out to be sort of the 3 operant variables, was sufficiently high so that when we looked at lower dimensions, we weren't artificially being capped, which seems to hold up. Said differently, so what if you have 200 neurons? Maybe the dimensionality is 400 and you only think it's 200, or you think it's lower because of some limitation. Only send out 8, for 2 hours of recording. So there seems to be good news there, at least.
I'll just maybe add I'm going to be less impartial for a second and just say, I think there are good ways to consider how one might estimate the amount of the number of dimensions you can even make meaningful statements about. So so if you go to higher and higher dimensions with a limited data sample, some of those dimensions are just going to be noise. Just with the limitations of our techniques right now, and we can make inferences about that by saying, at what point does adding some number of dimensions fail to predict things like held out neurons or that sort of thing? Like, when do we lose predictive power? So I think there are principled ways of at least saying that, like, with our limited limited measurements. We're limited in the number of kind of signal dimensions we might be able to look at. So we've got about 10 more minutes here on this panel. Thank you all thanks Flip for donating your time. This has been wonderful. One higher level question I think that kind of fits in with some themes from the YouTube comments is for everyone. In terms of perspective, to kind of move this framework forward, do folks feel like we need more data? Do we need more theory? Do we need more tools? I mean, obviously, to some extent, the answer is trivially all of the above, but I'm wondering if people are feeling, strongly about one way versus the other.
Well, I'll just say that I think it's Mehrdad's arrows combining from his brain side and his task behavior side. I think that's the real puzzle, is what is that mapping between those two sides? And it's not clear to me that that's going to come just from doing this kind of analysis on more and more cognitive tasks. I mean, it should be done, but it seems to me that there's going to have to be a different conceptual framework for the cognitive side, which will help find that mapping that Mehrdad put there. I mean, I think he was very, very honest in putting that there, but I couldn't really hear how the project would proceed.
Neither do I. So yeah, Abby, you go first.
Oh, well, so at the risk of deflating this whole conversation, like I read many of these papers that are based in cortex, and I don't get the strong sense of hypothesis-driven science. I tend to hear, here's the state space, and then there's kind of an interpretation that's placed on top of that. And those interpretations are often really fascinating, and I think they're cool. But I feel like, the whole architecture of hot field attractors and things like that are the hypothesis space that state space trajectories address. And I would love it if there were, more of that kind of theory that said, okay, we actually predict the following thing. We're going to test that and refute that hypothesis or support it. And I think, to me, that would allow me to feel a little bit more, confident that we're getting somewhere, instead of just imposing, explanations on these patterns of activity described in these ways. I think that in the history of neuroscience, that a lot of progress has been made using hypotheses to, test functions of circuits. And I think without that sort of order, that we easily lose our way.
What I was trying to say to that, Abigail, at the end of my slides was, when humans make straight reaching movements with bell-shaped velocity profiles, so you saw these invariances, reaches were straight, there were bell-shaped velocity profiles, huge amounts of theoretical effort was then expended to try and understand why are reaches straight with bell-shaped velocity profiles. So those invariances led to a lot of the kind of hypothesis generation and theorizing that I think you would actually quite like, and then you do experiments to try and disprove or prove that. And I was trying to argue that these state spaces and these trajectories are those kinds of invariances. They are clues, like behavior is, to come up with the kind of theories and hypotheses and testable ones. But what's happened, I think, to your point, is instead of being the springboard to do theorizing like straight reaches and bell-shaped velocity profiles did, they become the theory themselves, right? They become the explanation rather than the reason to start to develop the kind of hypotheses you're asking for. So I completely agree that we've done this bizarre act of substitution where the thing that needs to be explained has sort of crept in and become the explanation post hoc. And I think we should just take a step back and you consider them behaviors in and of themselves that need to be theorized about, just like straight reaches and bell-shaped velocity profiles.
Yeah, I would agree with that in the following sense, but slightly tweak the message a little bit. Even in this current day and age, I think we all believe in hypotheses in science, so that's good. So there's no counter argument there. And all that's happening, and I guess what I'm saying when I say it's a nascent field still, and Sarab and Abby and Meredith are explicitly saying we need to move towards hypotheses, is that there's had to be sort of a phase of work of understanding a different way to look at it. A neural trajectory is nothing more than a multi-neuron PSTH. It's nothing magical. You don't look at a PSTH and say, okay. So it's an interesting schism. I think many of us, and we're here, sort of saying this. That's not hypothesis testing in and of itself. If that idea has come about that is the end goal, just to make pretty colored lines, then that's, I think, sad. That was never the intent. Instead, there are a growing number of papers now that a certain number of years have gone by that we've started to understand them better, where I think hypotheses are being tested. And we could all point to specific papers and so forth, be it in the Meredad's work or in Sarab's work on learning, or Abby's work, Cora Ames' work, and so forth. And it'll be an interesting future. I would love to add hypotheses to it, but just like, there were not hypotheses when first developing any number of microscopic techniques, right? It is only after you started seeing something that you then got the ideas, like John was saying. So again, I'm truly just offering that as we never mean to. I'm the worst promoter of this myself, obviously.
One important
rather just let papers do the work. Yeah.
I think to hopefully maybe come back to Abby's thinking here, that one just wants to make sure that the framework itself doesn't orthogonalize out certain types of explanations or dynamics that are needed, right? That by doing this, say, projection into a low-dimensional space a priori, you may lose, and thinking about it as a system of ODEs, you may lose the ability to connect with the true underlying explanations and true hypotheses. So there's just a word of maybe caution in just making sure that one stays open-minded to alternate mechanisms that don't fall naturally within the framework.
Yeah, I agree. And even the initial rotatory work of Mark's and John Cunningham's in the lab, the backstory to that was very much inspired by Bill Kristen's work and Gilles Laurent's work and so forth. And like, well, how are you going to produce movement, CPGs and oscillators? So it wasn't just a fishing expedition, but I don't like to push that point, because it's much better for people to, make their own decision as to whether that's true or not. I very much like how Sarab said it, that, David Cicillo could have predicted it. History always works its way out, that it's always dialogue, of course.
I wanted to quickly follow up with Abby and John. What hypothesis would you find satisfying? I mean, as Krishna just reminded us, right? We can train RNNs now on the tasks that we're interested in. And, as we start doing more complicated tasks, it will become even more important to have some sort of good way of generating a hypothesis. And maybe this is where this notion of implementation, representation, and so on rear their head in again. But if I have an RNN that solves a task and I have access to essentially all the information on its innards, I can make very specific predictions about the kinds of responses that I should be seeing at the level of single units, at the level of behavior, at the level of the population. And to me, that is a hypothesis. It isn't, I picked a random task, I trained the monkey to do it, I recorded some neurons, I saw some random structure, and now I'm trying to tell a story about it. It's really the other way around, where I trained a network to understand something. I really messed with it quite a bit to have certain things pop out, as Abby described. Divergence was one of the examples she used. Is that not a satisfying hypothesis to you? That doesn't seem like a fishing expedition to me.
No, I never used the word fishing expedition once today, right? All I'm saying is that there's a difference between doing work like, the Cicillo work where you predict the responses you're going to find in motor cortex, or the incredibly, with the ventral stream where you can literally predict what the neurons are going to do in a particular part of the pathway in the ventral stream. But you're not explaining it, right? You're just back to where you were before. You're going to have to do more than just reproduce something in order to have understood it, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, I'm just saying that understanding in science requires some compressible, communicable idea that leads to new ideas, right? Totally. And that's not the same as going, ooh, voila, my network has done the same thing as a biological one. It's not uninteresting, nor is it it's possibly a springboard for the kind of more compressible concept or principle, but it's not going to be that principle in and of itself. That's yet to come, is what I'm saying.
I completely agree with you. But all I'm saying is that the tools that we have, I think it's always easy to say more is coming, more neurons are coming, more tools are coming, more perturbations are coming, but we already have a lot of them. And I guess I'm just saying that we have certain tools right now, and I do think they will help us satisfy you at least.
Sure, even if, it's just saying to me more cool tools isn't going to do it, but if it does happen, I hope it will.
I think that's what Saurabh's saying. He's saying that what we can learn from the analysis of these networks is an underlying computational structure in terms of attractors and fixed points. And if we get that, maybe that's the new replacement, right, for normalization, pooling, right, the steps of the algorithms, as Abby talked about earlier. And we need to train ourselves to think more intelligently, right, at a systems and a dynamical systems level about the components of an algorithm in terms of these motifs of network behavior. And that now then was a different form of hypothesis, right?
No, and yeah, I think the architectures of these RNNs are actually important if we're going to use them to understand biology. And, because these universal approximators can do anything, if they don't resemble biology, then we're going to be studying them and not the biology. So I totally think that building models helps us see the world better. And insofar as that's true, I think they're wildly valuable. But I think we need to be crisper with what the hypothesis is. What is the hypothesis? That the brain is a recurrent neural network? Well, yeah, that's true. Are the specific predictions that derive from that very useful? Mehrdad, you need to talk.
I actually wanted to go back to the question that was originally asked, which is, what do we need? And I was going to speak to the point that I started with, is what do we need from computation through dynamics to study cognition? More neurons, more, what do we need? My feeling is that no, more neurons is not necessarily, it's a great thing to have, but I think the major roadblock in my mind for what's next for computation through dynamics in that space is, maybe I'm channeling to some extent John, but I think what we're missing is clever behavioral tasks where we can actually, from those, make inferences about some sort of precise inferences about the latent variables that are, if you will, the building blocks of those sets of behaviors that you want to study. We have to first identify those. And then it's better to look at behaviors that are kind of counterintuitive, right? So just generic behaviors, you know, of getting a sensory input, integrating and making decisions is a really good starting point. But I think there are things that humans are particularly bad at, for example, and those are really good things to study. Like, for example, we're really bad at multitasking, and that's not because we don't have enough neurons. We certainly do have enough neurons. So, like, you know, we come up with solutions to certain types of problems that are very human solutions to these problems. These are not the only solutions. And this dovetails with what Abby Person was saying about the architecture of the networks, right? The fact that, you know, we like to think about a difficult problem in a hierarchical manner, solve counterfactuals, and not go on parallel, you know, solve all the problem on all branches of the decision tree is a solution that humans choose. It was not a necessary, so it's not the only solution that one can come up to solve these sorts of problems. So I think what I think is needed is to find features in human behavior that in fact deviate from current models, right? The recurrent networks might solve problems in certain ways. Like, for example, you know, offline simulations that, you know, require counting vowels in facetious is something that, you know, we can actually go after with computation through dynamics, but we have to now extend the computation through dynamics to ask, how do you run really rapid dynamics over some representation as an intervention on that representation to actually, like, for example, count the vowels and add them up. Right? That's something that is, I think, within the framework of computation through dynamics. You need a structure that you can run the dynamics on, and you need, you know, a readout system from that counts every time you reach a vowel. That can be written out algorithmically as something that a machine wants to solve, and it has a very clear dynamic computation through dynamics built into it. So I think the real next step, I mean, not the step, like not the comprehensive theory that Krishna is talking about, just the next step, I think, is to think about things like online simulation, offline simulation, the types of dimensionality reduction that comes from a detailed analysis of behavior. Those are going to be really valuable in sort of like parsing out the state space, not the neural space today, but our conceptual state space of how we should be thinking about these problems. That's my view of what's the next really valuable steps are.
Can I agree, but maybe take a slightly different angle on terms of complexity versus simplicity of tasks? Because, you know, Marcus Meister has really beautifully made the point that we get these rodents to do tasks that for them are incredibly hard, right? There is one bit task where they have to turn left or right in response to a visual stimulus, whereas they do incredibly complicated things in a matter of 10 trials, right? So I'm not sure that studying that very, you know, what is hard for a rodent task is the right way to reveal, you know, how the brain works. So instead, they're doing these amazing things, right, with actually very limited data. And maybe in those cases, we should be turning more to those more natural tasks where very rapid learning is happening in order to understand that structure, rather than, you know, doing something more like an RNN where it does take hundreds of thousands of trials to make them do something, this poor network do something that it doesn't actually know how to do.
Yeah, I mean, what I mean by clever behavior are things that the animals actually, these are sorts of things that are matched to the cognitive adaptations of the species of interest, not stuff that, you know, you as a human consider this is an interesting cognitive task. And that's why I said, you know, like integration of a stimulus and decision is a good starting point, but it takes you down a particular path of thinking about cognitive tasks that maybe down the line in animal models will not pay off as much as one would like to, right? You're coming up with things that are, you know, rodents navigate beautifully well and do really interesting stuff. So maybe that's what we should be studying in rodents, right? That's yeah, very much aligned with what you're saying.
All right, I'm gonna pause this there. So first and foremost, thank you very much to the panelists. I think this has been a really fascinating conversation. I just wanted to, you know, I'm reminded of something Conrad Cording said, John, in one of your learning salons, that, you know, we we want to maintain a diversity of approaches as we, in science and as we study these things. And when approaches get popular, we need to take time to take a step back and understand, what are we really doing? Try to understand, do we have any kind of pitfalls or blind spots that we're not seeing? And I really appreciate you all being willing to get on here and have those conversations. So, and then also thank you very much to the audience. To let everybody know, the recording of this will be available on the Simons-Emory website within a week or so. So fascinating, and I really hope that these discussions can continue. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much for inviting me in. It was lots of fun to be on all these sort of Brady Bunch squares arguing about dynamical systems.
Same. Thank you so much.
Everyone, thanks for the great questions.
Thanks, Chetan, for all your hard work.
Agreed. Thank you. Thanks all the organizers.
See you, everyone.